A noble was already standing in my doorway with a scroll in his hand, and I had been alive in this body for 11 minutes. That is not a figure of speech. I counted it off a church bell 3 streets over while my hands were still shaking from a fire that had not happened to this body at all. Before that hour was out, he would carry my grandfather's charter and my apprentice both back through that door, and I would stand in the road and tell him, in front of a street that had just finished laughing at me, that I meant to buy every stone of it back with one scale. He was tall, groomed, dressed as money dresses, when it wants to look like taste instead. He set one boot on the threshold of a workshop that was, as of this morning, apparently mine. "Fine bench," he said, running 2 fingers along the edge of it. "Whoever built this understood weight. A shame what debt does to a good bench." I opened my mouth to ask where I was, and what came out instead was an evaluation. "Your shoulder plate rides high on the left. Whoever fitted it hated you and did it quietly, 1 finger of clearance short, and in a year you will not be able to raise that arm past your ear." He stopped touching the bench. The street behind him found that funnier than I meant it to be. 2 women at a stall laughed into their sleeves. A boy stopped hauling coal to watch. His name, I would learn inside the hour, was Gareth Kane, heir to the license that let his house tax every forge on this side of the river. He recovered his smile as fast as a man recovers a dropped coin, like it had never left his hand. "Clever tongue for a man 3 days behind on his bond," he said, and lifted a scroll off my own workbench, a scroll I had not seen before this instant, and read out a name that was apparently mine now, Adrian Vale, and under it a debt that belonged to a grandfather I did not remember dying. 11 minutes earlier, I had been a different man entirely, a master armorer in a different world, hauling someone else's unfinished breastplate out of a burning shop because it was not mine to let burn, and the roof had chosen that exact moment to answer me. That fire lasted maybe 500 words in my memory, and it ends the same way every time, with heat and no more air and a stranger's plate still in my arms. I woke measuring a girl's wrist by feel, the way my grandfather taught me to measure everything before I even had eyes open. The girl was Pell. Stone-colored patches climbed her forearms like a hand had pressed wet clay there and let it set. She was already flinching before Gareth reached for her, because she already knew what an unlicensed charter meant for a scale-blooded child standing near it. "Property of no house. Once the charter's gone," Gareth said almost gently, like a man explaining a rule he did not write and is glad he does not have to. "She goes to the yard until someone licenses her again." He took her by the wrist. She did not scream. She counted under her breath instead, some private ladder of numbers, the kind a person runs to keep from screaming. The street murmured its approval, low and satisfied, the sound a crowd makes when it has decided the outcome was always coming and is relieved to finally see it land. Here is the one thing this whole street did not know, standing there watching a girl get taken for her blood. Every scale they had ever bought, sold, or hunted for had come off something that could have handed it to them for nothing, if anyone had ever thought to ask. Dragons wear faces. They walk your markets, price your bread, marry into your guilds, and nobody in Thornmere has ever caught one doing it, because the shedding itself is not a killing at all. It falls off them the way a snake sheds skin, on its own season, whole and clean, if the person holding the knife would only put it down. I did not know that yet either, not with my eyes, only with the strange calm settling behind my sternum that told me some other part of me already did. What I did know, looking at Gareth's hand closed around an 11-year-old wrist while a street cheered his manners, was that I was going to buy this street back, every stone of it, and I was going to do it with exactly 1 scale. I said so out loud, not a threat, not yet. Just a number spoken plainly enough that 3 people near the gate turned to look at the man saying it. Gareth laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man being told a fish will one day own the river. "Measure something first," he said, and left with my apprentice and my grandfather's name on his scroll. The shop, once he was gone, was Salawad's Outkiwi, once was smaller than I expected, and precisely the shape my hands already understood. Tongs where I would have hung them. A ledger with Vale written across the spine in a hand that was not mine and somehow was. A brass plate above the forge read Tier 1. hand stamped, and under it a second smaller plate, blank, waiting for a name to be scratched into it the first time a piece earned its way past that number. I found the ledger's last page, and under my grandfather's cramped hand, a single line, underlined twice, like he had needed to say it to himself more than once. Armor never fits a man you didn't measure. I understood that line all at once and completely, like a joke, landing before anyone has told it. And I wrote beneath it, the only entry the book had left in it for me. One name, Pell, measured this morning, without her asking, before I even knew her name. That was all Emmerich Vale had left me. A cold forge, a debt I had not made, a girl taken in front of a street that clapped for it, and one rule that turned out to be the realest law in this entire world. On the floor by the door, caught in a crack between two boards where nobody but a man on his knees would find it, lay a single scale, stone gray, warm as a coal, even hours cold. Pell had shed it herself, quietly, sometime before Gareth ever reached the threshold. I picked it up the way I would pick up a diamond somebody had mistaken for gravel, because that is exactly what it was. Not stolen, not cut from anything, given, by accident, by a frightened child to a floor that did not deserve it. I worked through the night on a single scale as my grandfather would have worked a royal commission, because I had never learned how to work anything else. By dawn, it was set into a ring, polished until the gray took light and threw it back like water does. Mounted on a band I cut from the last decent silver in the shop. I carried it to the city gate myself, to the exact stall where the toll collectors weighed debt against families every morning. The same collectors who had stood behind Gareth not 12 hours before. A merchant's wife stopped first, the kind of woman who has priced every stone in 3 kingdoms and stopped being impressed by most of them. She asked what it was, then asked again in a different voice once she held it. I told her the truth, that it came off a living girl who gave it up on her own, and that no blade had ever touched the thing she was wearing when it happened. She paid more for it than the whole of my grandfather's bond, standing at the same gate where that bond had been collected against a child the morning before, in front of the same men who had smiled while they took her. One of the collectors recognized the ring on her hand an hour later and went pale in a very specific way. A man understanding he has been present for 2 different transactions and only now sees they were the same one. Word of it moved down Kale Row faster than I did. By the time I reached my own door, 3 neighbors were standing outside it who had not looked at me directly the morning before. One of them was a laundress named Tane, who worked the yard 2 doors down and had never once in my grandfather's time knocked on this door for anything but overdue coin. She said she had heard the ring paid for a whole street, then, warming to it, for a kingdom, before she caught herself and admitted she had only ever heard the bit about the gate. I told her the true number, which was smaller than either rumor and still larger than any single sale my grandfather had ever made in one morning, and watched her repeat it back to herself twice before she believed her own mouth. Word like that does not need help traveling on a street this narrow. By midday, a cooper from the corner had found a reason to stand near my window, and by evening, 2 men I had never met were asking carefully whether the workshop was taking new custom. I told them all the same thing my grandfather's ledger had already told me. Bring the person, not the coin first. I measure by hand, or I do not build at all. I did not go looking for Gareth Kane. I went looking for Pell instead, and found only the yard gate locked, and a clerk who told me licensing took 3 days at the fastest, and that no amount of coin moved it faster, only paper did. Astrto constan astrut est in 3 days. I turned that number over the way I would turn over a bad weld, looking for the flaw in it, and found one immediately. Paper moved fastest for a man with a name the guild already trusted. I did not have that name yet. I had a ledger with 1 entry in it, a brass plate with a number 1 stamped into it, and a street that had started, for the first time since I woke in it, to look at my door instead of past it. That would have to be enough for now. I went back inside, set the empty ring box on the counter where customers would see it, and started measuring the next thing that would fit under my hands, because that had always been the only argument I ever really trusted. Behind the counter, where only I would see it, I started a second line in the ledger, one I meant to keep as honestly as the first. Kale Row, it said. Purchase pending. The licensing clerk had a voice built for saying no pleasantly, and she used it on me twice before I even finished my question. 3 days minimum, she said again, sliding a form across the counter I had not asked for. Faster only for a house the guild already trusts, and yours, forgive me, is not currently a house anyone trusts. Anas damitisai. Izai, I asked what would change that. She gave me the look you give a man who has asked a wall to move. Finished commissions with named buyers, she said. A ledger the assessors can read. Time. I had 1 ring's worth of reputation and a debt that used to belong to a dead man. Time was the only thing on her list I actually had, so I decided to spend it as my grandfather always had, on work instead of complaint. Word had already reached further than I expected. By the second morning, 3 separate people stood outside, asking whether the man who bought back a street with 1 scale would look at their work, and I turned away 2 of them because they wanted a price before they would let me touch anything. The third one did not offer a price at all. She stood at the edge of the doorway, the way people stand at the edge of water they are not sure holds their weight, and said only that she had heard I measured fair. Her name was Isolda. Burn scars ran up 1 forearm in a pattern too clean to be an accident, old enough to have gone pale, but never quite flat. She kept the arm turned slightly away from me without seeming to notice she did it. I asked what she needed built. She said nothing at first, in the specific way of someone who has learned that wanting something out loud is how it gets taken from you before you finish the sentence. I have learned not to push a silence like that. My grandfather never did either, not with metal and not with people. I set the kettle on instead and worked on the ledger while she decided whether the room was safe. She spoke first in short, flat statements, no questions in them at all, because a question to her was a rope handed to a stranger. I do not sleep near open flame anymore. I do not let strangers near my left side. I do not want charity. I told her charity was not on offer. What I build for the person standing in front of me, and what I charge is honest. And what I take from you to build it is a measure, taken by hand, only if you say I can. That last part I said slower than the rest, because I had not once said it out loud on purpose since waking in this body, and I meant for her to hear the difference between an offer and an order. She held very still for a long moment. Then she turned the burned arm toward me, palm up, and said she could do that much. I took her measure as my grandfather taught me, slow along the forearm, wrist, the long muscle under the burn, naming all 3 lengths aloud as I found them so she would always know what I had and had not touched. Somewhere in the middle of it, I understood something that made my hands go still for a second. Pell, the morning Gareth came, I had measured without asking, half asleep, a reflex from a body that was not fully mine yet. It had worked. The ledger had not cared that she never said yes. I cared. I decided then, kneeling on my own floor with Isolda's arm steady in my hands, that it would never happen that way again, not once, not even by accident. When I finished, a single scale worked loose from the inside of her forearm, near the old scar, and dropped into my palm on its own, warm, the deep orange of a coal that has not gone out. Not battle bright, not the poor cracked color fear leaves behind either. Clean. Held a blade edge without complaint when I tested it later that night. Whatever she felt handing it to me, it was not fear, and it was not performance. She watched me set it on the scale beside the first entry in the ledger, under Pell's name, and asked, in her flat, careful voice, whether it went somewhere permanent now. I told her yes. I told her the truth about the rest of it too, since she had trusted me with a burned arm and had earned the whole of it. The mark I would eventually stamp into anything made from her scale could not be set for 9 full days after it left her. Some rule about how fresh material holds a name, and until then it belonged to no one but her. She said that was the first honest limit anyone had ever given her about her own body. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing and put the kettle back on, and we sat with the silence a while longer, and it was a different silence than the one she walked in with. I built her a wrist guard from that single scale, thin enough to wear under a sleeve, angled to protect the burn line, and nothing else, because that was the only thing she had ever actually asked me for once she finally asked. She paid what she could, which was little, and I told her the rest of the price was the scale itself, and that we were even, and she left with her arm covered for the first time in longer than she wanted to say. 2 names in the ledger now, 2 scales on the scale beside it, one gray, one the color of a low coal. My grandfather's brass plate over the forge still read Tier 1, but the blank one beneath it did not feel quite as blank as it had 2 days before. Gareth Kane came by that afternoon, unannounced, like a man dropping in on a shop he still believes he owns the street around. He did not come for Pell. He came, I understood within a minute, to see the man who had embarrassed him at his own gate. He praised the wrist guard sitting half-finished on my bench before he said a single word about anything else, running 2 fingers along the edge as he had run them along my counter the first day. And I understood then that the praise itself was the habit, not a kindness at all. "A clever work," he said. "Shame it only fits one arm in the whole world." He laughed at his own line, a genuinely warm laugh, the kind that makes a room like him despite itself, and I watched 2 of my own neighbors nearly laugh along before they caught themselves. I told him the fit was the entire point, and that a thing built for one person was worth more than a warehouse of things built for no one in particular, and that he was welcome to test that math against his own ledgers whenever he liked. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he mentioned lightly, almost as an afterthought on his way back out the door, that scale had gotten strangely scarce on the open market this week, and that a man in his position had first pick of whatever came through the gate regardless. I did not understand the shape of that threat yet, not fully, not until later, when I learned through a dyer 2 doors down that Kane agents had spent the last 2 days quietly buying every legal shedding claim in the district before it even reached the open square. He was not hunting anymore. He had heard what one honest scale sold for at my gate, and decided the smarter move was to starve me of the next one before I ever got my hands on it. I stood in the doorway after he left and watched the street go back to its ordinary noise, hammers and hawkers, and the smell of 2 different forges competing for the same wind, and thought about how little of this my grandfather's ledger had ever needed to explain, because none of it had ever happened to him. 2 names measured. 1 street already half bought back and paid in advance. A girl locked in a licensing yard, counting down a stretch of days I could not shorten with money. And now a man quietly closing every honest door in the district before I could reach the next one. I picked up my tools and went back to work, because that had always been the only argument I fully trusted, and because somewhere inside a locked yard 3 streets over, a child was counting too, and I intended to give her a better number to count toward than the one Gareth Kane had left her with. The dyer who told me about Kane's buying spree told me one more thing before she went back to her vats. Almost as a courtesy for the wrist guard I had mended for her boy the week before I even remembered mending it. The autumn fair opened in 9 days, on the square outside the guild hall, and House Kane always kept the largest stall in it, glass-fronted, guarded, built specifically so every visiting lord could see whose scale was worth buying. She said Kane's father had never lost a single fair in 30 years, and that Gareth meant to keep that streak like a family grave, tended out of habit more than love. 9 days. Long enough to finish Isolde's second piece and start a third. Long enough, if I worked every hour the light allowed, to have something worth setting on a table across from Kane's glass front instead of behind it. I did not know yet what that something would be. I only knew the shape of the number I needed it to answer. The exact weight of a licensing bond the clerk had already told me a name like mine could not yet move faster than paper allowed. 9 days to build a name that paper would finally believe. And one girl locked 3 streets away, still counting toward a number nobody had given her yet. A woman built like a closed door came into the shop 4 days before the fair, looked at my bench for exactly as long as it took to judge it, and said she needed a pauldron reforged before she rode out with a caravan contract. Her name was Kalis. She did not say please, and she did not say sorry for the dent already in the plate she dropped on my counter, and I liked her immediately for that reason. I asked how the dent happened. She told me in 4 flat sentences the entire shape of a fight I had not seen, which shoulder had turned too slow, which strike she should have read a half-second earlier, which of her 2 men had frozen and which had not. Ande secure. Anasa stains, nai, of Bavawan mavs, built armor for careful men my whole life, and none of them ever described their own mistakes with that much precision. I told her so. She said mistakes were the only part of a fight worth remembering, since the parts that went right rarely needed fixing. I asked, once the plate was measured and the price agreed, whether she would let me take a hand measure too. For the record, no charge attached to it, only so the shop knew her by more than a dented shoulder. She looked at me a long moment, judging me as she had judged the bench, weighing whether the offer cost her anything. Then she held out her forearm the way a person hands over a weapon they still trust themselves to take back. A scale came loose at the inner elbow while I worked, storm-colored, a gray that moved like it had weather trapped inside it. She watched it fall into my palm with no expression at all, and told me flatly that if I wasted it on something decorative, she would take the pauldron elsewhere. I told her it was going into a ring, and that the ring was going to sit across a square from the largest scale display in this city inside 4 days, and that I intended to win. She considered that as carefully as she had considered everything else, then said that was at least not decorative. I worked those 4 days as I have only ever worked once before, in the last stretch before the fire, hands moving faster than thought. Isolde's second small scraps set beside Kalis's storm gray, and Pell's single stone piece kept apart, untouched, because that one was not for sale at any price. By the morning of the fair, I had 2 finished pieces, and a name still too new for the guild to trust, and 1 locked yard 3 streets over, holding the only person either piece was actually meant to buy back. The guild hall square filled before the sun cleared the rooftops, stalls in 2 long rows, banners snapping, a city dressed for a day it treated like a holiday. House Kane's stall stood at the head of the second row, glass-fronted just as promised, guarded by 2 men in house colors, carrying the particular boredom of men who have never once needed to actually work. Inside that glass sat more scale than I had seen in one place in my life. A Syrian Igel Conste, Lysiak arranged by color like stones in a jeweler's tray, each piece labeled with a hunt date and a hunter's name. Bardolf B. Ilatizialsint. Trophies, dressed up as merchandise. I set my table directly across from it, on the far side of the square, with nothing behind me but a plain cloth and 2 pieces of jewelry that would have fit inside 1 closed fist. The crowd noticed the imbalance before it noticed anything else. A boy pointed and laughed. An old woman shook her head at the audacity of it. 1 small table facing down, 30 years of undefeated glass. Then the light shifted, as it does an hour or 2 after dawn, and Kalis's ring caught it first, before anything sitting behind the glass across the square. It did not glitter as hunted scale glitters, hard and flat, like a knife-catching sun. It moved the way real weather moves, gray folding into itself and out again. Alive in a way the whole glass case across the square simply was not, no matter how many hunt dates were pinned beneath it. A merchant's daughter reached the table first, then her mother, then a man in a guild badge who asked, in the tone of someone who already suspected the answer and wanted to be told he was wrong, where the stone had come from. I told him the truth loudly enough for the row on either side to hear it. No stone. Scale given, not taken, off a woman standing not 30 paces from this table who could tell him herself if he wanted to ask her. Kalis did not step forward to be looked at. She only said, from where she stood with her arms crossed, that she had handed it over herself and would have broken the wrist of anyone who tried to take it instead. The guildman looked at Kane's glass case, then back at my table, then asked the question that mattered most to a man in his position, whether the stone would hold under strike, as the case across the square claimed its trophies did. I set the ring on the table's edge and struck it once, hard, with the flat of a hammer I had carried across the square for exactly this reason. It rang true, and did not so much as scratch. Half the crowd flinched. Nobody at the glass front across the square had ever offered to do that. Gareth Kane arrived at his own stall not long after, drawn, I would guess, by a crowd on the wrong side of the square, and found half of it facing away from his glass front for the first time in longer than his father had been dead. He recovered fast, as he always did, and called out pleasantly that a parlor trick with 1 ring did not undo 30 years of proven stock, and that sentiment was a poor substitute for provenance. I told him provenance was the one thing he did not have, since not one label in his case named a living owner who could stand up and confirm the story on the tag, and every single piece on my table could. That landed harder than the hammer had. A few people near the front actually turned to check his labels, reading dates instead of admiring color for once, and I watched 2 of them step back from the glass like it had gotten warmer than they expected. I had planned to sell both pieces separately and carry the coin to the licensing yard by evening. Instead, a woman I did not recognize, richly dressed, carrying the particular quiet of someone who already knows she will win the argument, asked what it would take to buy both. On the spot, no haggling. I told her the true price, which was not coin at all. A licensing bond, clear today, for one scale-blooded apprentice currently held in the guild yard 3 streets from this square, under the name Pell. She did not blink. She sent a servant walking before I finished the sentence, and stood with me in a silence that felt entirely different from any silence Isolde had ever given me, patient rather than guarded, the silence of someone enjoying a story more than she was letting on. The servant returned inside the hour with a guild clerk in tow, papers already half signed, because a bond this size, settled in coin, moves considerably faster than 3 days of waiting ever could. Elle came through the square gate not long after that, still in the same clothes from the morning Gareth took her, smaller than I remembered, counting under her breath again until she saw me, and then not counting anymore. She did not run, she walked, careful, like someone who has spent days being told how little she is allowed to want anything, and stopped an arm's length away and asked very quietly if the yard would come back for her again. I told her no, and meant it with all the weight of every hour I had spent those 4 days, and she believed me as children believe adults, only after the proof has already happened in front of them. Gareth watched that exchange from his own stall, and for once in all the days since I woke in this body, I saw something on his face that was not amusement and was not contempt either. It looked, for just a moment, like arithmetic. Behind him, half in shadow at the edge of the glass case, stood an older man in appraiser's grays, thin, careful, the sort of quiet presence a great house keeps close and never introduces by name. I looked at him without meaning to, as you look toward a sound that does not match the room it is in. For one instant, less than a breath, the shape of him was not the shape of an old man in appraiser's grays at all. Something taller stood inside that stillness, patient in a way no human patience ever quite manages, gone again before I could be sure I had seen it. He met my eyes across the square and held them, and he did not look away first. I did, and I spent the walk home turning over what I had just seen and could not yet name. I took Pell home that evening with 2 empty display cases and a ledger heavier by one name I already had, since she had been the first entry from the very start, only now written beside a date that finally meant something had been undone instead of only counted. Kalis walked with us as far as the gate, silent, and told me, right before she turned off toward the caravan road, that she would be bringing her work to Adrian Vale from now on, and that this was, in her own words, the closest thing to a compliment she gave anyone still breathing. Behind us, across a square already emptying of its holiday crowd, House Kane's glass front stood where it always had, 30 years of trophies still sealed behind clean glass, and for the first time in 30 years, not the largest thing anyone in that square was talking about. The brass plate over the forge read Tier 2 before I had even finished cleaning the hammer I used at the fair, which told me the ledger kept its own accounting, whether or not I remembered to check it. I did not have time to admire it. 3 days after the fair, the honest scale market in Thornmere had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with season and everything to do with Gareth Kane. A trader who used to bring me offcuts twice a week stopped coming entirely, and when I finally cornered him at his own stall, he would not meet my eyes. House Kane, he said, had bought standing rights to every legal shedding claim within 2 days' ride in advance, at prices no honest man could refuse, and still eat that winter. He was not lying to hurt me. He was a man protecting a family, and I could not fault that, even while it strangled the one thing my whole plan depended on. Pell watched me work that afternoon without asking why my hands had gone slower. Into the middle of that quiet walked a woman with an actual ledger under her arm, bound in gray leather, the kind of book that has never once in its life been wrong about a number and intends to keep it that way. She introduced herself as Nira, guild auditor, and said she had been sent to verify the claims attached to 2 rings sold at the autumn fair, since a bond that large clearing in a single afternoon had raised more than one eyebrow in the guild hall. I told her to ask whatever she liked. She asked everything: where the storm gray scale had come from, in what order, on what date, whether Kalis had signed anything, whether the transaction had been witnessed, whether I could produce the empty setting from before the stone went in. I produced all of it. She read my ledger front to back once, then a second time out loud, checking each line against what I had just told her, then a third time in complete silence, running one finger down the page like she expected the ink to change if she looked hard enough. 3 passes, she said, when she finally closed the book. I do not trust a story that only survives one reading. I told her mine had survived a fire, a debt, and a street that laughed at me first, and it was welcome to survive her ledger too. That earned the smallest crack of something that might, in a different woman, have been an actual smile. She said one fare, however loud, would never buy house trust from the guild, though my numbers at least had not lied to her once across 3 readings, and that counted for more than most houses ever managed on a first review. I asked what it would take to move faster than the clerk's 3-day minimum on every future measure I brought her, since Kane had just proven how much damage could be done to a person in 3 days. She said the guild moved at the speed of proof, not sympathy, and that if I wanted faster paper, I needed a longer unbroken ledger, more name buyers who would stand behind their purchase in person if asked, and, ideally, one guild-backed voucher who had personally verified the chain from measure to sale. I asked her to be that voucher. She held my eye a while with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic on a risk she had not planned to take that morning, and said she would need to see the actual measuring done, start to finish, before she would ever put her own name against mine. I told her that was fair and asked, since she was already standing close enough, whether she would let me measure her as well. For the record, the same offer I had given everyone else who walked through this door. She said auditors did not typically volunteer themselves as evidence in the case they were reviewing. I told her that was why it would be the strongest evidence she had. She considered that for exactly as long as it took to set the gray ledger down on my counter. The scale that came loose from the inside of her wrist was pale as river ice, and it did not simply lie in my palm as the others had. It seemed to hold the light a beat longer before letting it go, like still water holding a reflection a moment after the wind has moved on. She stared at it with an expression I had not seen from her yet, something closer to surprise than she was comfortable showing. I asked if that was unusual. She said quietly that most of her kind who gave scale to a market gave it because they had already stopped expecting anyone to ask permission first. Watching it come off clean, on her own terms, in front of someone who had waited for her to decide, had not happened to her since before she started keeping that ledger at all. I understood then, as I had half understood watching the man in gray at the fair, that Nira was not entirely what her guild badge said she was, and that she had walked into my shop already knowing that measuring her would mean I would know it too. I said nothing about that beyond thanking her, and setting her scale beside the others, and writing her name into the ledger the same as anyone else's, because whatever else she was, in this room she had asked to be measured honestly, and I intended to treat that as honestly as it deserved. She watched me write her name, and said, in a voice with less auditor in it than before, that she would stand as guild voucher for this shop starting today, on the strength of what she had just watched happen to her own arm, and that any clerk who argued with her about it could take the matter up with her directly. That single sentence did more for the licensing clock than 4 solid days of my own arguing had managed. She also told me, once the ledger was closed, and the ordinary stiffness had come back into her voice, how House Kane had structured his buying spree, since guild auditors see every standing claim that crosses a desk, whether they are asked to or not. He had not bought the scale itself, she said. He had bought the right of first offer on every future shedding within his radius, locking honest sellers into contracts that would not pay out until the next season turned. Most of them had sold their patience rather than their scale, and would be quietly starving for coin themselves before the snow came. I asked what that left me. She said precisely that it left the open market closed to me for a season, but that it left every single person who had not yet been asked, since Kane's agents could only buy from people willing to be found in a market stall in the first place. That was all of it, laid out in front of me as she laid out every number, exact and unsentimental. Kane had closed one door completely. He had never once considered that most of what I actually needed did not walk through doors he could see. I thought of Kalis, found through a dented pauldron and nothing else. I thought of Isolde, who had never once stood in a market stall in her life. I thought of the man in gray at the fair, who was not remotely the kind of person Kane's contracts could ever reach, because he was not, whatever else he was, for sale. Nira read something in my face and asked what I was thinking. I told her that Kane had just taught me, without meaning to, what my actual business was, and it was never going to be a market stall to begin with. It was going to be every single person in the city nobody had ever bothered to ask. She wrote that down too, in a private notebook this time, not the guild ledger, the first thing all afternoon she had bothered to record just for herself, and said in a tone that had almost entirely stopped sounding like an auditor that she wanted to see how far that idea actually went. 4 names in the ledger now. A brass plate reading Tier 2 catching the last of the day's light, a trade route closed by a man who thought coin was the only door worth guarding, and a guild voucher standing in my own doorway, telling me quietly that he had guarded the wrong one. The Foundry District smelled like scorched iron, even on a calm day, and on the day I first walked into it, the smell had teeth in it, sharp enough that Pell pulled her sleeve up over her nose without being told. The support beam in the 3rd furnace hall had blistered and dropped that morning, not far enough to kill anyone, close enough that 2 smiths had been carried out with burns, bad enough to need more than salve. I had come for a different reason entirely, chasing a rumor Nira passed along about a healer near the furnace gate who treated burns nobody else in the district would touch, in the hope she might know where a man could find honest cloth that actually held against heat. I found her kneeling over one of the injured smiths, gloved hands never once landing directly on his skin, working entirely through cloth and careful angles, murmuring instructions to an assistant instead of touching the wound herself. She worked fast and precise, and never came within arm's reach of anyone she was not actively treating. And when a second smith reached out gratefully to clasp her wrist, she stepped back from it so smoothly, it looked almost like part of the treatment. Her name was Vessa. When I introduced myself, she kept 3 full steps of distance between us the entire conversation, standing half turned away, like someone for whom facing another person directly costs more than they want to spend. I asked about the cloth. She said, without turning fully toward me, that nothing sold in this district held against a real furnace fire, and that every fireproof lining installed in these halls came from a single house contract. The 2 men carried out that morning were carried out because that lining had failed precisely where it mattered. I asked whose contract. She said House Kane's, the same coating sold to half the foundries on this side of the river, cheaper than anything else on the market, and, in her professional opinion, not remotely worth what it cost in burns. I told her I intended to do something about that eventually, once I had material enough to try, and asked, since we were already talking about what covers a person's skin, whether she would ever consider letting someone measure her as I measured everyone else who walked into my shop. She went very still. Then she said flatly that nobody had touched her on purpose in longer than she was willing to count. She did not mind contact. Her own skin carried enough of her kind's nature in it that an ungloved touch from her could raise a rash on anyone she was not extremely careful with. I told her I did not need to touch her to take a proper measure. My grandfather taught cloth measure and hand measure both, and cloth measure needs nothing but a length of marked ribbon and a subject willing to hold still while I read the numbers off it from a full arm's length away. She turned fully around, squarely facing me at last, and studied me as Nira had studied her own ledger, checking for the seam where the offer would turn out to cost her something after all. I do not want charity either, she said, echoing Isolde's exact words from weeks before without knowing it, and I told her the same thing I had told Isolde, that this was not charity, only a measure, taken however she needed it taken, or not taken at all if she preferred that instead. She held out one gloved arm and let me lay the ribbon along it, without once closing the distance between us myself, reading each length aloud as I always did, and somewhere around the wrist, a single scale worked loose through the glove's seam, and fell to the ground rather than into anyone's palm at all. Yellow-green, faintly luminous even in daylight. And when I picked it up with a cloth rather than bare fingers out of simple respect for what she had just told me, she watched that choice more closely than she had watched anything else all afternoon. Most people flinch from what I am eventually, Adrian, she said. You just changed how you pick things up. I told her that seemed like the smaller adjustment of the two of us, and she almost laughed, a short, surprised sound she did not seem entirely used to making. I built her a set of overgloves from that single scale, cut to layer over the cloth ones she already wore, thin enough not to slow her hands during treatment, strong enough that the next patient who reached for her gratefully would not need to be warned off first. She wore them out of the shop that same evening, testing the give of the fingers against each other all the way to the door, and told me, right before she left, that if I ever actually did make a fireproof cloth worth trusting, She would be the first to tell every burn ward in the district whose name to ask for. That gave the afternoon its second half. I walked back through the furnace halls with Pell trailing a step behind, both of us studying the collapsed beam up close, and understood within a minute of looking at the failed lining what was wrong with it. Kane's coating was cut for cost, not for heat, thinned with cheaper binding than the scale alone could carry, which meant every layer of it was weaker than the raw material used to make it. Lining built from whole scale, freely given, properly set, would outlast it the way stone outlasts plaster dressed up to look like stone. Din say so stas. No star, I did not have nearly enough material yet to prove that on anything larger than a glove. Yellow-green, storm gray, coal orange, river pale. 4 colors sitting in one small case, none of them enough on its own to line a furnace door, let alone stand inside one. The foundry's overseer found me still crouched by the failed beam and asked, half joking, whether the man who bought back a street with one scale had also come to fix his furnace. I told him soon, and meant it more seriously than his tone had invited. He said the guild inspection on that contract came due within the month. Routine. The kind that usually rubber-stamped whatever house already held the license, unless someone showed up with proof strong enough to make the inspectors actually look twice. I thought of Nira, 3 careful readings deep into any claim before she trusted it, and understood that proof strong enough to survive an inspection like that would need to be more than words. It would need to be a demonstration nobody in that hall could argue with afterward. The brass plate over my forge had crept to tier 3 sometime that week, without my noticing when. 3 small marks scratched beneath tier 2 where the blank space used to be. This time, the number felt less like a milestone and more like a countdown running the other direction, toward whatever it would take to walk into a burning furnace and come back out the other side. 5 names in the ledger now, 4 colors of scale, sitting in a case too small for what I meant to build with them. A failed contract quietly rotting under a routine inspection date, and a foundry full of men who had already learned the hard way what House Kane's cheaper price actually cost. A guild inspector who would decide the foundry contract turned out to be a narrow, unhurried man named Kor, and Nira warned me the night before his visit that he had approved House Kane's lining twice already without once asking to see it tested against actual fire. Routine renewals do not test anything, she said. They read the paperwork Kane's clerks hand them and sign where the ribbon says sign. If you want him to look past the ribbon, you have to give him a reason strong enough that not looking becomes the harder choice. I asked what would count as strong enough. She said, flatly, a demonstration nobody in that hall could argue with afterward, and reminded me that I had used almost that exact phrase myself the week before, as though I had already known the answer and simply had not built it yet. I spent that night at the bench doing something I had never once attempted, weaving rather than setting, taking thin-cut strips of all 4 colors in the working case and working them together as my grandfather wove wire into a single cable stronger than any one strand alone. Coal orange for Isolde's steadiness, storm gray for Kalis's refusal to flinch, river pale for Nira's patience, yellow-green for Vessa's careful distance, none of them enough on its own to line a furnace door. Together, woven tight, they held a weight none of them could have carried alone. Pell sat up with me past midnight, handing me strips as I called for them, and asked, somewhere near the 3rd hour, whether the cloak I was building would actually stop fire or only look like it did. I told her I did not fully know yet. And that was the entire reason we were about to find out in front of witnesses instead of alone. By morning, I had 1 coat, heavy across the shoulders, stiff in a way that would loosen with wear, and no second attempt if the first one failed. The furnace hall filled early, foundry workers lining the walls as they had lined the fair square weeks before, Word having done what Word always did on this street once it learned the shape of a good story. Kor arrived precisely on time, Kane's clerk at his elbow with a folder of renewal papers already half signed. Gareth arrived not long after, unbothered, like a man arriving at a formality he has attended 30 times before. He praised the furnace hall's construction on his way in, the great iron doors, the draft channels, admiring it out loud the same way he had once admired my bench, before turning to Kor and asking pleasantly whether they might simply proceed. I stepped forward before the ribbon could reach his folder and asked Core, in front of the whole hall, whether the guild's own charter required a lining to be tested rather than only certified on paper. I had read that clause myself 2 nights running and found it still technically active, however long it had gone unused. Core checked the folder himself this time instead of taking Kane's word for it and found the clause exactly where I said it would be, dusty with disuse but never repealed. He looked, for once since walking in, genuinely uncertain what to do with a morning that had stopped being routine. Gareth laughed easily and said a young house eager to make a name for itself was welcome to waste the guild's time however it liked, but that his own lining had passed inspection for 11 years running and needed no theater to prove what the paper already proved. I told him theater was exactly what I was offering, and that I would stand inside the 3rd furnace with the door shut and the fire built to working heat, wearing nothing but a coat cut from scale given freely, for as long as it took the hall to see for itself whether paper or cloth was telling the truth. A murmur went through the workers along the wall, the specific sound a crowd makes when it realizes it is about to see something it will still be describing a year from now. Core looked at Gareth, then at me, then finally asked, formally and for the record, whether Adrian Vale understood what he was proposing. I understood it completely. I also understood, standing there with the coat heavy across my shoulders, that I had never actually tested it beyond holding one sleeve to a candle flame the week before, and that everyone in this hall, including me, was about to find out together whether a night's weaving held. Vessa was in the crowd, I noticed then. Arms crossed, 3 careful steps back from everyone around her, watching with an expression that had nothing careful left in it at all. She had come, I realized, because she had promised to tell every burn ward in the district whose name to trust, and she wanted to see with her own eyes whether that promise would still be true by evening. The smiths built the furnace to full heat, while Core's clerk timed it against a guild-issued glass, and the great iron door stood open long enough that every man in the hall could feel the wall of heat rolling off it from 10 paces back, close enough to make several men along the wall step away without meaning to. I put the coat on properly in front of witnesses, laced the collar, and Pell, standing closer than Vessa would have allowed herself, reached up and fixed the last clasp herself, because my hands, for just a moment, were not entirely steady. Gareth said, not unkindly this time, that he would rather see a man walk this back than watch a fool prove a point with his own skin, and for one strange second, it sounded like he actually meant it. I told him I appreciated the concern more than he probably wanted me to, and stepped through the door before either of us could say anything else. The inside of a working furnace does not describe easily to anyone who has not stood inside one. Heat does not simply surround you there, it presses, from every direction at once, the air itself thick enough to feel solid against bare skin. Bare skin was exactly what I did not have. The coat held the worst of it, back the way a good roof holds back rain. Not silent, not painless, but survivable. A heat I could feel through the weave, rather than one that reached the flesh beneath it. I counted my own breaths as Pell counted under hers, because it kept my mind from doing anything else while the world outside the door narrowed down to orange light and the specific low roar a furnace makes at full heat, patient and enormous and entirely uninterested in whether I lived. Core's clerk called the count from outside, numbers I could just hear over the roar, and somewhere past the point I had privately promised myself I could last, I was still standing, and the coat had not so much as scorched at the seams. When the door finally opened and I stepped back out into ordinary air, the hall had gone silent in the particular way a crowd goes silent right before it decides how loudly to react. Someone near the wall started it, one shout, and then the whole room broke at once, workers pounding the iron railings, a noise that had nothing polite left in it. Core examined the coat himself before he examined anything on Kane's folder, running a gloved hand along the weave, checking a Kane or Chaisko Donwai, checking the seams. He said finally, in the flat voice of a man documenting a fact rather than offering an opinion, that he had never once in 11 years of inspections seen a lining survive full heat with a living man still inside it. He signed nothing that day for House Kane. Instead, he asked, formally, in front of the whole hall, whether Vale Workshop would be prepared to supply this district's fireproof lining going forward under a proper standing contract, subject to the same test being repeated whenever the guild required it. I said yes before he finished the question. Vessa said, loudly enough for the back wall to hear it, that she had told every burn ward in this district whose name to trust, and that as of this morning, she finally had proof to back the promise up. Gareth did not stay to watch the paperwork drawn up. He left the hall quietly, without a single joke on his way out, which told me more about how the morning had actually landed than anything his face had shown while it happened. I found out 3 days later, from a smith who owed his eyebrows to the coat I had been wearing, what Gareth had spent those 3 days doing instead of accepting the loss gracefully. He had gone to a forger 2 districts over, a man known for copying merchant seals onto goods that had never touched the merchant they claimed, and paid him to study my brand closely enough to reproduce it. I did not yet know what he meant to press that false mark onto. I only knew, standing in a furnace hall that had cheered my name an hour before, that a man who could not outbuild me had decided to try lying about what he was selling instead. Whatever came out of that decision was going to land on someone who had never asked for any of it, and I had no way yet of knowing who. The plate above my forge read, Tier 4 before the week was finished, and for once the number felt less like proof of what I had already done, and more like a promise about how much further there still was to go, with a man 2 districts over already at work on the first real lie anyone had told using my own name. A man I had never met walked into my shop 11 days after the furnace and set a cracked pauldron on my counter, hard enough that the crack widened while I was still looking at it. "Sold me this," he said, and it split open on the second parry, and I could have lost the arm under it. He was not shouting, which somehow made it worse, the flat certainty of a man who had already decided who was to blame before he ever knocked. I turned the pauldron over in my hands and knew within the first few seconds that I had never made it. The stamp on the inside curve was close enough to fool a man who had only ever seen my mark once, but the depth of the strike was wrong, shallower, hurried, the work of someone copying a shape, rather than someone who understood what the shape meant. I told him so, plainly, and showed him the difference against a genuine piece from my own case, how the true stamp bit deeper into the metal because I set it by hand with my grandfather's own punch, not stamped fast from a mold. He did not want to hear that at first. He had paid honest coin at an honest-looking stall for a piece with my name pressed into it, and being told the name was stolen rather than false did not change the fact that his arm had nearly paid for someone else's lie. I asked where he bought it. He named a trader 2 streets from the guild hall, a man I did not know, who had apparently been selling small pieces stamped, given freely at prices just low enough to undercut anything I sold directly, and just high enough that nobody thought to ask why. I went to that stall myself within the hour, Nira at my side because she had heard the entire story before I finished telling it and refused to let me walk into a fraud complaint without a guild voucher standing beside me. The trader folded almost immediately once Nira produced her badge, the particular fast collapse of a man who had always known the arrangement would not survive daylight and had simply been hoping daylight would take longer to arrive. He named Gareth Steward as the one who supplied the stock, paid him a flat fee for shelf space and silence, and swore, with the specific desperation of a man protecting himself rather than anyone above him, that he had never once asked where the material actually came from. Nira asked to see the remaining stock. What came out from under his counter was worse than either of us expected. A dozen small pieces, rings and clasps mostly, all bearing a stamp close enough to mine to pass a careless glance. All of them, once I turned them over one by one, were made from scale that had never once been given. I could feel the difference under my own hands before I could see it. The same as a bad weld, brittle in a way none of my own material ever was, dull under the light instead of alive with it, the flat deadness that comes off anything taken instead of handed over. Scale seized by force, or bought second-hand from a man who seized it, dies and stays dead, no matter whose name gets pressed into it afterward. I asked the trader whether he knew that difference himself. He said he did not, that scale was scale to him, coin in, coin out, and that the mark on it was the only thing that had ever told him one piece was worth more than another. That answer sat with me longer than I wanted it to. Somewhere in a market 2 streets from the guild hall, ordinary people had been paying honest prices for dead material dressed up in my name, trusting a mark that was supposed to mean the opposite of what it had actually been sold to guarantee. Nira confiscated the stock formally, wrote out a receipt in her own hand, and told the trader that a full guild inquiry would follow, though not, she added quietly, once we were back outside, quickly enough to satisfy either of us tonight. I asked her what quickly enough would even look like. She said fraud complaints against a licensed house moved through committees, hearings, appeals, the entire slow machinery built to protect houses with old names from young accusers with new ones. Gareth's steward, not Gareth himself, had made every visible arrangement, which meant the paper trail stopped a full rank short of the man who had ordered it. I told her it was the same arithmetic I had watched cross Gareth's face at the fair. The moment he understood he could not outbuild me and started looking for a different kind of ledger to win in instead. She did not disagree. Instead, she opened her private notebook, the one she had started the day I measured her, and wrote something down I did not ask to read. If the guild's own machinery would not move fast enough by itself, she told me, then the next inspection that could move it needed to be built strong enough that no committee could quietly bury it afterward. I thought of Kor standing in the furnace hall with his gloved hand along the seam of a coat that had done what paper said it could not do. I thought about what it would take to get that same unhurried, letter-bound man standing in front of Kane's actual warehouse stock instead of one small trader's shelf. Vesa found me later that evening, having heard the story from a burn ward patient who had heard it from the smith who had heard it from Nira, and asked in her flat, careful voice whether the fake pieces could hurt anyone in ways real material never would. I told her the truth, that dead scale was brittle in ways that would fail at the worst possible moment, as that pauldron had failed on a second parry instead of the first, and that every piece still out there wearing my name was a promise about to be broken on somebody's arm at the worst possible moment. She said quietly that she intended to tell every patient she treated from now on how to check a stamp's depth with their thumbnail, the same trick I had just shown her, and that word would move through the burn wards faster than any guild committee ever moved through anything. Pell had been listening from the doorway throughout, as she listened to most things she was not technically included in, and asked, once Vesa left, whether Gareth Kane was allowed to keep doing things like this simply because his name was older than ours. I told her the honest answer, which she was old enough by then to hear, that older names get more patience from the people meant to judge them. The only way to change that was to make our name too loud, too proven, and too publicly trusted to bury quietly, the same way Kane's own name had been trusted for 30 years before anyone thought to look twice. She considered that a while, in the serious way she considered most things now, and said that if anyone ever tried to wear our name again without earning it, she wanted to be the one who caught them at it. She had been the first name in the ledger, she said, and felt that ought to come with some responsibility attached to it. I told her it already did, and meant it, and set the confiscated pieces on the counter beside my own genuine case, so the difference would be visible to anyone who walked through the door from now on, dead metal beside living metal, close enough in shape that only the truth between them told them apart. The number above the forge had not moved since the furnace, still reading tier 4, and now the number bothered me less than the case sitting beside it, a dozen small dead things wearing a name I had built out of exactly the opposite promise, waiting for a hearing that would take its time arriving. Nira found the land before I did, which did not surprise me by then, since she had taken to reading tax rolls as other people read letters from home. A stretch of scorched common ground past the eastern wall, she said, spreading a survey sheet across my counter. Abandoned since a brick kiln fire gutted it a decade back. Owned by the crown rather than any house, and cheap enough that a workshop still climbing out of debt could make an offer worth taking. I asked why nobody had built there already. She said the same reason most people avoided anything scorched, superstition mostly, and the honest fact that nobody with capital had ever needed cheap land badly enough to fight the smell of old ash out of it. I did not mind the smell. I had woken into this life out of a fire myself, and there was something almost fair about the idea of building the first thing that was fully mine on ground that had already burned once and come out the other side of it. I walked the plot myself the next morning, Pell at my heel counting her own paces as she counted everything now, and found past the collapsed kiln a stretch of open ground wide enough for a proper street, a forge row, room enough to grow into rather than merely fit inside. We were not alone on that walk for long. A woman stood near the old kiln's ruin when we crested the last rise, dressed for court rather than for a burned commons, a folded fan held loosely at her side. She watched us the way a person watches something they have already decided to be interested in and are waiting to be properly introduced to. She introduced herself as Mira and said, before I could ask, that she had heard about the furnace and the fair both, secondhand, as half the city apparently had by now, and had come to see the ground for herself before deciding whether the rumors about Adrian Vale were worth her attention. I asked what would decide that for her. She said, precisely, that she had spent most of her life in rooms where she was permitted to be present and never permitted to be heard. She had come to see whether a man who bought a street back with one honest scale might be building somewhere. A voice like hers would count for something instead of decorating the room. That was not a small thing to say to a stranger standing on a burned commons, and I told her so before she could take it back. She opened the fan then, a small mirror set into its center panel, angled it toward the morning light, and said that in every court she had ever stood in, a well-placed mirror caught more attention than any argument she was allowed to finish out loud. I asked, since we were already speaking plainly, whether she would let me measure her as I measured everyone whose trust I was hoping to earn. She considered the offer with the same unhurried care she seemed to bring to everything, and said she would allow it, on the condition that whatever came of it, she be given an actual seat at whatever this ground eventually became, not simply a place in the crowd watching it be built. I told her that was not a condition at all, since I had never once intended to build anything here that treated its own people as scenery, and that if this ground became what I hoped it would, every person measured on it would have exactly that. A seat earned the day they gave me their trust, and not one day later. She held out one hand, palm up, calm in a way that made the exchange feel less like a transaction and more like a decision she had already made before she ever walked out to meet us. The scale that came loose was pale gold, and it did not simply catch the light as the others had. It seemed to hold it, throw it gently back at an angle, as her small mirror had thrown the morning sun a moment before, as though whatever she was carried the same instinct into everything she touched. She looked at it a long moment in my palm and said quietly that she had given scale exactly once before in her life to a court that had recorded the transaction in a ledger and never once bothered to record her name beside it, only the price. I told her name went in first this time, before the scale, before anything else, and wrote Mira into the ledger myself while she watched. In ink she could see clearly from where she stood. That seemed to settle something in her that the fan and the mirror and the careful courtly bearing had not quite managed on their own. She said, in a different voice than she had used until then, that she wanted to help draft whatever charter this ground would eventually need, since she understood how words like that got twisted against the very people they claimed to protect, and had spent years learning to spot the twist before it landed. I told her I would take that help gladly, and meant it, since I had never once in my life drafted anything more legal than a customer receipt, and the ground under our feet was about to need considerably more than that if it was going to become what I intended. We walked the plot together the rest of that morning, Mira naming, almost idly, which crown officials would need to sign off on a settlement charter, and which of them could be reasoned with and which could not. Pell trailed behind with a stick, marking out, with entirely serious concentration, where she thought the first forge row ought to stand. By afternoon, I had made the Crown's clerk an offer for the land, funded by what remained of the fair sale and the new fireproof contract's first payment, and by evening, the offer had been accepted. Quickly, the speed of a bureau glad to be rid of ground nobody had wanted in 10 years. Word reached Gareth before the ink on the deed had properly dried, since word always seemed to reach him faster than it reached anyone else in this city. He came to Kale Row himself that evening, not smiling this time, and asked, without any of his usual warmth, what I thought I was building out past the eastern wall. I told him the truth, plainly, because I had decided somewhere on that walk that plainness was going to be the foundation of whatever I built from here forward. A town. Not a workshop, not a warehouse, an actual town, open to anyone willing to be measured honestly, scale-blooded or otherwise, built on ground nobody else had wanted badly enough to fight me for it. It was quiet for a moment, longer than I had ever seen him go, without a compliment or a threat ready in his mouth. Then he said, carefully, that a town needed more than good intentions to survive its first winter, and that he intended to make certain mine did not get the chance to prove otherwise. I told him he was welcome to try, and that everything I had built so far, he had watched me build it in front of witnesses he could not later argue away, and that this would be no different. He left without his usual parting line, and I found that silence considerably more unsettling than anything he had ever actually said to me. That night, back at the shop, Mira stayed late drafting the first rough lines of a charter by candlelight, reading each clause aloud to Pell and me both, asking after every single line whether it protected the person it claimed to protect or only sounded like it did. Somewhere past midnight, she read out a line she had written herself, unprompted, and asked if I would agree to it, standing as the very first article of the charter. Every resident measured here keeps their name, their voice, and their scale as their own, regardless of what they were before they arrived. I told her I would sign that with my own hand and mean every word of it, and she smiled then, small and real, the first expression I had seen from her all day that had nothing courtly left in it at all. 6 names in the ledger by that evening, a deed to scorched ground that had already survived 1 fire and was about to be asked to survive quite a few more. A fan with a mirror set into its center, propped now against my own counter, where the light caught it every morning, and a name for the ground itself that came to me somewhere near dawn, while I was still turning that day over in my head, unbidden and immediately certain. Emberhold. Mira found the lever we needed inside the very charter she had spent 3 nights drafting, buried in a clause about crown-owned land that she had copied, almost as an afterthought, from an older statute governing markets built on royal ground. Any settlement chartered directly under the crown, she read aloud, may petition for an expedited guild hearing on any complaint touching its founding trade, bypassing the ordinary committee queue, provided the petition names a licensed guild inspector willing to stand behind it personally. I asked whether Kor would stand behind it. Nira said she had already asked him, the morning after the pauldron complaint, and that he had said yes before she finished explaining why, since a man does not test a lining with his own gloved hand and then look away when the same house's other claims come into question. We filed the petition 3 days after Emberhold's deed was signed, naming House Kane's full warehouse stock rather than one small trader's shelf. We cited the counterfeit pauldron, the dozen dead pieces already sitting in Nira's evidence room, and the 11-year unexamined renewal of a fireproof contract that had, in the end, failed to hold heat at all. The hearing was set for the guild hall's main floor rather than a private committee room, a detail Mira insisted on, and won through an argument about public record that I only half followed and Nira followed completely, nodding along like she was watching a favorite student pass a difficult exam. Gareth's steward arrived first, pale, flanked by 2 clerks carrying ledgers thick enough to double as shields, and took a seat as far from the inspection table as the room allowed. Gareth himself arrived not long after, composed, dressed as he always dressed for a room he expected to win. Kor opened the hearing without ceremony, laid the confiscated pauldron and the dozen dead pieces on the table, and asked, formally, whether House Kane could account for the origin of stock bearing a given freely mark that did not match any measure in the mark's own registered ledger. The steward answered first, exactly as Nira had predicted, insisting the arrangement with the small trader had been his own initiative, unknown to the house, a rogue contract he deeply regretted. Gareth let him finish every word of it before saying anything at all, which told me more than the speech itself did. Kor was not satisfied with that, and said so plainly. A single trader's shelf explained a dozen pieces. It did not explain, he said, why House Kane's own registered warehouse, 3 streets from this hall, held stock numbering in the hundreds under the same disputed mark, a fact the guild's own storage tallies had quietly recorded for over a year, without anyone thinking to question it. That number landed in the room as the furnace had landed weeks before, an absolute stillness, followed by a low rising murmur. I had known about the small trader. I had not known the true scale of it, and watching the number said aloud in front of the full hall, neither, I realized, had most of the people sitting in it. Gareth rose then, calm, and asked to speak for the house directly, rather than let his steward carry the weight of it any further. A request Kor granted with a small nod that looked, for just a moment, almost respectful. He did not deny the number. He said instead that House Kane had held the given freely mark's older, original meaning for 3 generations, since it was his own grandfather who first coined the phrase to describe scale purchased at fair market price rather than looted outright. Nothing about that older meaning, he said, had ever technically required the seller to be willing in the sense I had recently given it. That was, I understood immediately, a genuinely clever argument, built to turn my own mark's history against me in front of a room that respected old names more than new ones. I asked Core whether I might respond directly rather than through petition, and he allowed it. I told the hall the truth about the material itself, rather than about the history of the phrase stamped over it. I set one of the confiscated dead pieces on the table beside a genuine one from my own case, and asked Core to test both as he had tested my coat, though not with fire this time, only with the flat pressure of his thumb along the stamped edge. The dead piece gave slightly under pressure that would never have marked the living one, a difference small enough to miss by eye and impossible to miss by touch, and Core, testing both in front of the entire hall, confirmed it aloud so nobody could later claim the demonstration had been staged. I told the room what that difference meant. Scale taken by force or bought from someone who took it that way dies the moment it leaves the body, permanently, no matter what history a house wants to attach to the phrase stamped over it afterward. The name on a mark did not change the truth sitting underneath it, only the manner of the taking did, and that was not a thing any house could vote on. My grandfather wrote one line about this, and he was talking about steel, not about scale, and had never in his life seen either of the things I was holding up in front of that hall. Armor never fits a man you didn't measure. It turns out to be the same law on both sides of a fire, and it does not bend for anyone's family name. Bessa stood up from where she had been sitting quietly near the back, unasked, and said, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, that she had personally treated 3 patients that season whose gear had failed in precisely the same manner as the pauldron. Until that hour, she said, she had assumed it was bad luck, rather than a pattern anyone could have traced back to one warehouse. What tin var tensions in stations are when I det chad stations. That broke something in the room that Core's careful, unhurried procedure alone had not quite managed. A guild elder near the front asked directly how many of the pieces in Kane's registered warehouse could be proven, by that same thumb test, to be dead material sold under a mark that promised the opposite. Core ordered the warehouse opened for inspection that same afternoon, over Gareth's steward's objection and, notably, without any objection at all from Gareth himself. He sat still through the rest of the hearing with an expression I had only seen on him once before, in the square outside his own glass case, the look of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. Warehouse inspection, carried out under Core's own seal by evening, found nearly a third of the registered stock failed the thumb test outright, and a further portion Core flagged as suspicious enough to require individual review before it could be sold under any mark at all. I mais to skate not a strain. Just a did not stay for the full accounting. I walked back to Kale Row with Nira and Pell both, past a street that had gathered outside the guild hall, waiting for word as it had once gathered to watch Gareth take a charter off my own counter. Somewhere along that walk, I understood that the crowd's opinion had finally, fully and permanently turned. Tan caught up with us near the corner, out of breath, having heard the outcome from a runner 3 streets earlier than we had walked it. She said half the laundry lines on Kale Row were already talking about applying for work in Emberhold. Now that word had spread, the town would take anyone willing to be measured honestly, scale-blooded or not. I told her Emberhold needed that kind of person, someone the ordinary side of the city already trusted, to help build the first row of houses and tell the rest of the street the truth about what was actually happening out past the eastern wall, instead of whatever rumor got there first. She asked if that meant she had a job. I told her it meant she had the first one, since somebody needed to be the very first name in Emberhold's own ledger, as Pell had been the first in mine, and that I could not think of anyone better suited to carry that particular number. Gareth Kane did not come to Kale Row that night, and did not send a message either, and the silence itself told me something the hearing's outcome alone had not quite finished saying. A man who laughs first, then buys quietly, then lies with a forged mark, does not simply stop once all 3 of those moves have failed him in front of a room full of witnesses. He escalates, the way water finds a lower door once every other one has been shut. I did not know yet what that escalation would look like. I only knew, sitting up late that night, with the stamped plate above my forge, reading Tier 5, and the hall's verdict still ringing behind my ribs, that whatever came next would not arrive announced. Everything I had built so far, every name in the ledger, every scale given freely, had just become, in Gareth Kane's eyes, something worth taking back. By any means the law had not yet closed to him. Emberhold had a shared hearth before it had a proper wall, which tells you everything about what the first month of building actually looked like, and the woman who ran that hearth had a laugh you could hear from the forge row on a quiet evening. Her name was Orlin. Her husband, Hesk, worked the town's new bellows, broad-shouldered, slow-spoken, the kind of man who checked a joint 3 times before he trusted it and then trusted it completely. They had come to Emberhold in its second week, scale-blooded both, and told me, the day I measured them together, that they had spent 11 years pretending to be something they were not, in a village 2 days south, and had simply stopped being able to bear the pretending any longer. I asked what finally broke it. Orlin said it was hearing from a cousin's letter that a street in Thornmere had watched a man buy back an apprentice with 1 honest scale and cheer for it afterward. She had decided, reading that letter twice over, that she wanted to die somewhere that would cheer for her too, rather than somewhere that would only ever tolerate her at a careful distance. They had brought almost nothing with them. Hesk built the hearthstone surround himself over 3 days, testing every joint the way he tested everything. Orlin filled it that same week with a stew big enough to feed whoever showed up hungry, no questions asked, which by the second month meant most of the town on most evenings. I was at the shop that night, not the hearth, finishing a seam on a warded plate I had promised the new watchtower by morning, 1 last length of stitching that would not lie flat no matter how many times I reset it. And I told myself, as I always told myself, that a promise half kept was not kept at all. A boy came pounding on the door sometime past midnight, one of the new watchrunners, breathless, saying there was smoke over the eastern wall, thick and wrong, coming from the direction of the supply warehouse. I told him I was coming, and then I looked at the seam still lying wrong under my needle, and I told myself 1 more minute would not matter, because a warded plate left unfinished was a plate that would fail somebody exactly when they needed it not to. That minute became closer to 10 before I finally set the plate down half done and ran the entire distance to Emberhold, with my chest already burning before I ever saw the fire. The warehouse was fully alight by the time I reached the eastern wall, flame climbing through the roof timbers in a way that told me, even from a distance, that this had not started slow. Someone had set it to catch fast, at the one point in the structure where the whole season's grain stores sat beside the season's cut lumber, close enough together that either one burning meant both would. Kalis was already there, organizing a bucket line from the well with the flat, furious efficiency of someone who had run worse fires than this and hated every second of not already knowing how this one would end. She saw me and spent no breath on anything except instruction. 2 more lines, Adrian. West side first, the wind's carrying it that way. I fell into the line without asking a single question, because questions cost seconds and seconds. In a fire like that, cost more than questions were worth. Somewhere behind me, I heard Vessa's voice, sharp and clear, calling for anyone burned to come to her directly and no one else, and I understood distantly that she had reached the fire before I had. It was Hesk who went in first, past the point any of us would have stopped him, because a boy he had been teaching to work the bellows had gone back inside for a dog that would not leave the grain store. Hesk did not appear to consider, even for a second, that there might be a version of that rescue where he did not follow. He came out with the boy under one arm and the dog struggling against his chest, and set them both down clear of the flame, and turned immediately back toward the collapsing doorway, because Orlin, somewhere in the noise and the smoke, had started shouting his name in a voice that meant she thought he was still inside. He was not inside. She could not see that from where she stood. She went in after a version of him that had already come out safely, into a building that chose that exact moment to bring its roof down across the doorway she was standing in. Hesk went back in after her without a single word to anyone holding the bucket line, because there was never going to be a version of that night where he did not. I do not remember the next several minutes in any order that makes sense to tell. I remember Kalis pulling two men bodily away from the collapsed doorway before the second beam came down. I remember Vesa, gloves already off, hands bare and shaking, doing something I did not understand yet and would not let myself understand until much later. I remember Pell, somewhere behind me, not counting anymore, only screaming a name that was not mine. By the time the fire had burned itself down enough to let anyone close, there was nothing left to save. Hesk and Orlin were found together, near what had been the doorway, close enough that whatever the last thing either of them did was, they had not done it alone. I stood in the ash at first light, with a warded plate still half finished, on my own workbench 3 streets away. I understood, with a clarity that felt like being struck rather than like thinking, that the 1 minute I spent resetting a stitch that would not lie flat was a minute I would otherwise have spent already running toward a fire that needed every one of them. Nira found the truth of how it started before the ash had even fully cooled, because tracing a lie was the one thing grief had not managed to slow down in her. A worker hired only that week, knew enough that nobody had thought twice about him, had been paid in coin traced back through 2 hands to House Kane's own steward, to leave the warehouse's east door unbarred and walk the night watch's schedule out to whoever asked for it. I did not go looking for Gareth Kane that morning. I stood instead in the ruin of a building 2 people had died defending, and thought about every choice that had led to that minute mattering as much as it did. At the bottom of all of it, I found my own hands, still stitching a seam that had not needed to be perfect that night, only finished later. Pell found me there sometime past noon, quiet in a way I had not heard from her since the licensing yard, and asked in a small voice whether it was her fault. She had been the first name in the ledger, and had convinced herself, in the logic grief hands to children, that everything after her name was owed to her specifically. I told her the truth, the only thing I had left that felt honest enough to give her. It was not her fault. It was not anyone's fault standing in this ash except the man who paid for the door to be left open, and my own hands, which had chosen a seam over a fire when it mattered which one I chose. She did not answer that. She only leaned against my side and sighed as she had never quite let herself lean before, and we stood there together, while Kalis organized the digging, and Vesa moved among the wounded, with hands that had stopped shaking sometime in the last hour. Nira stood a little apart, notebook open, writing down every fact she could hold steady enough to record. The ledger sitting open on my own counter, 3 streets away, had always felt to me like a scoreboard, 1 entry taller, with every person who trusted me enough to be measured. I understood, standing in that ash, that it had never actually been a scoreboard at all, not really, and that I had simply been fortunate enough, until that night, never to have to feel the weight of what every single name in it actually meant. 2 names would never be written into it now, because neither Hesk nor Orlin had ever asked to be measured, only to be housed, fed, and left alone to be what they already were, and I understood, standing there, that the ledger's real number had never been the count of scales given. It was the count of people I had promised, however quietly, to keep alive, and I had just failed that promise for the first time since I made it. We buried them at the edge of the forge row 2 days later, in ground that would one day, I decided standing over it, become the center of whatever Emberhold eventually grew into, so that no one walking through the heart of this town could ever forget, however far it grew, what the first winter had actually cost. Gareth Kane did not attend the burial, and did not send word, and watching the ground close over 2 people who had only ever wanted to stop hiding, I understood that the war between us had stopped being about scale, or coin, or even Pell's stolen charter. It had become, from that morning forward, about how many more names like theirs he was willing to spend before someone finally made him stop. Kalis rebuilt the watch rotation from nothing in 4 days, and the version she built bore almost no resemblance to the loose, trusting arrangement that had let one bribed stranger walk the night's schedule out the front gate. Nobody stands a post alone anymore, she told the assembled town on the fifth morning, standing on the still scorched foundation of the old warehouse, because she said the town needed to hear this exact spot decide something better than what had happened there. 2 to a post, rotated without warning, and every new hire vetted by someone who already trusts them before they ever touch a schedule. I asked her, once the crowd dispersed, whether that meant Emberhold could no longer take people in as quickly as it had. She said flatly that it meant Emberhold would take people in exactly as quickly, only more carefully, and that carefully was a word this town had earned the hard way and was not going to unlearn a second time. I did not argue with her. I had spent 5 days turning one unfinished stitch over in my head until it had worn a groove there, and I trusted, more than I trusted almost anything else in that stretch, that Kalis would build the wall my own carelessness had left standing open. A stranger arrived on the 6th day, on foot, alone, dressed plainly enough that the new watch nearly turned her away at the gate before something in her bearing made the younger of the two guards hesitate and send for me instead. She was old in a way that did not match her face at all, ancient in her stillness rather than in any visible mark of age. She introduced herself simply as Aurelia and said she had walked 3 days once word reached her of what had happened here, because Hesk and Orlin had been known to her people long before either of them ever reached Emberhold. I asked how she had heard so quickly. She said, with the faint patience of someone explaining something to a young species, that her kind kept better records of each other across greater distances than humans generally assumed. Death like theirs, chosen openly rather than hunted in secret, did not go unnoticed by anyone who still remembered what open used to mean. She asked to see where they were buried. I walked her there myself, past the new watch posts Kalis had doubled, to the far end of the forge row, where the ground was still raw. She stood over it a long while without speaking, in a silence that had none of Isolde's caution in it, and none of Vessa's distance either, only a depth I did not have the years to properly measure. She spoke, finally, 3 names I did not recognize, old names, and told me they belonged to the last 3 who had tried to live this openly before Hesk and Orlin. Each of them was dead inside a season, each death quietly folded into her people's memory, as proof that the old way, hiding, scattering, wearing a human face, and never once removing it, was the only one that worked. I told her I understood why her people had believed that for so long, and that I intended to spend whatever was left of my own life proving the belief wrong, however many more graves it cost me along the way to doing it. She studied me a while after I said that, weighing it, as near a way to ledger she had not yet decided to trust. She said she had not come only to grieve. She had come to decide with her own eyes whether this ground was worth what it had already cost, and whether the man building it deserved to be trusted with whatever her people still had left to give. I asked what that decision would look like. She held out one hand without waiting for me to offer, and said that she had given her own scale exactly twice before in 3 centuries, both times to people who had earned it the hard way, and that she intended to make this the 3rd. The scale that came away from her was the color of old stone, worn smooth by a river that no longer ran, and it did not feel in my palm like the others had. It felt heavier than its size should have allowed, the way a very old object always feels heavier than a new one built to the same measurements. I wrote her name into the ledger beside Mira's, and she watched me do it with an expression I had not seen from her yet, something almost like relief, as though the act of being written down honestly by a hand that had asked first mattered to her more than any amount of coin or protection ever could. She stayed 3 nights before she left again, teaching Pell in the evenings small pieces of a history none of the rest of us had ever been told. In the morning, she finally walked back out through the gate. She told me that word of what happened here, both the death and the answer to it, would travel further than 3 days now, whether I wanted it to or not. That warning proved accurate, faster than I expected. 8 days after the fire, a man in the gray and green of the Hunter's Order rode up to Emberhold's gate with an escort of 6, unarmed himself, and asked formally, to speak with whoever governed the town. His name was Halvik Ost, Warden of the Order, and he did not come in with the swagger I had half braced for. He dismounted at the gate itself, rather than riding through it, and waited to be invited the rest of the distance, which told me something about the man before he had said a single word. I met him at the new hearth, rebuilt smaller than Orland's original, and offered him what was left of the day's stew, which he accepted without hesitation, and ate in a way that suggested he had eaten worse in worse company more than once in his life. He came, he said, because a Kane steward had reported the fire to the crown as scale-blooded arson turned against itself, dragons fighting dragons, a story he had disbelieved from its first sentence and was obligated to investigate before it hardened into an official record nobody could later correct. I told him the truth of it plainly: the bribed worker, the traced coin, the two people who had died only because they had finally stopped hiding what they were. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said quietly that it matched what his own scouts had already half suspected, and that he intended to make sure the Crown's record reflected the truth rather than House Kane's version of it. Asked why a warden of the hunters would go out of his way to protect the reputation of the very people his order existed to hunt. He set his bowl down and took his time before he answered, and when he did, there was no cruelty in it at all, only a tiredness that seemed to run considerably deeper than one long ride. "I do not hate what you are protecting," he said. "I hate what happens to my own people if the world stops needing hunters at all. 3,000 families feed their children on what my order brings in every season, 3 generations deep in some of them, and every scale you convince the world it can simply be given, freely, without a single hunt required, is a season's wage taken from a family that has never once known another trade." I had not thought of it from that angle before, not fully, and I told him so honestly because he had earned that much by riding out here to say it to my face. He said most people did not, because it is easier to see a hunter as a villain than as a father doing the only work his grandfather ever taught him, and that he did not expect me to solve that problem, only to understand it was real before I decided how much of his world to unmake. I told him I had no interest in unmaking anyone's honest living, only in ending the part of it built on force and forgery, and that if his order's families needed a new trade, I would rather spend my own life helping build it than spend it pretending his people's hunger was not a real cost of what I was building. He did not answer that immediately. He finished the stew instead, in the same unhurried way he had started it, and said, finally, that he would carry the true account of the fire back to the crown himself. He hoped, for both our sakes, that I meant what I had just said, because a man who claimed to care about cost and then forgot it the moment it stopped being convenient was, in his long experience, more dangerous than an honest enemy ever was. He rode out that evening with his escort, unhurried, the same way he had arrived, and I stood at the gate watching him go. I had just met the one force in this conflict that was neither cruel nor greedy, only afraid in a way that made him, in some ways, harder to face than Gareth Kane had ever been. 7 names in the ledger now, the 7th heavier than its size should have allowed, sitting beside the grave of 2 people who had never made it in at all. A watch rotation that no longer trusted easily. Warden riding back toward the crown with the truth he had promised to carry honestly. And somewhere past the eastern hills, 3,000 hunting families who had never once been given a reason to want anything I was building to succeed. 2 months after the fire, Emberhold had grown enough that I could no longer name every face at the morning bell, which felt, some days, like its own kind of victory, and on other days, like a whole new set of things I now had to learn to trust without measuring them myself. Tan had taken to the town's ledger as Nira had taken to mine, though hers tracked houses and trades rather than scales, and she ran the morning bell like a proper mayor, if Emberhold had gotten around to deciding it needed one yet. Pell, meanwhile, had appointed herself quality inspector of anything that left the forge row, a title nobody had actually given her, and walked the finished pieces with a small tin ruler that did not quite fit her hand, marking flaws in chalk with the exact seriousness of someone twice her age. She caught a genuine problem that week, a shield facing with a hairline crack no adult eye in the row had noticed, and announced it to the entire forge with such solemn pride that Kalis, who almost never laughed at anything, actually did. That was the kind of morning it had become by the time the two strangers arrived at the gate, mid-morning, dressed in the leather aprons of working smiths rather than merchants, and asked, nervously, whether Vale Workshop was still taking measures from anyone willing. I recognized the older one before he said his own name. A broad, quiet man I had seen twice before, standing near the back of House Kane's warehouse, the day it was opened for inspection. One of the appraisers who had watched a third of his own stock fail the thumb test without saying a single word. His name was Corin, and the younger woman with him was his apprentice, Fenna, and he told me plainly that he had spent 11 years appraising scale for House Kane and had never once, in all that time, been told to check whether a piece had been given freely, only whether it would sell. He said the warehouse inspection had changed something in him he could not put back as it had been. He had gone home that night and looked at his own hands and understood, after 11 years, exactly what work they had actually been doing. I asked what finally brought him to my gate, instead of simply quitting quietly somewhere else. He said quiet was not an option anymore. Not after the fire. Not after watching Gareth Stewart stand in front of a full guild hall and call two dead people's home an act of dragons fighting dragons. He intended to leave House Kane the same way I had once bought back a street, loudly, in front of everyone who had ever watched him work. I told him Emberhold would take him gladly, and asked what that loud departure would actually look like. He smiled, his first since walking through the gate, a tired smile that still had something genuinely pleased underneath it, and said he had already told 3 other smiths inside House Kane the exact date he intended to walk out, and that most of them had quietly agreed to walk with him. It came on the 9th day after that, 7 of them in all, appraisers and smiths both, walking out of House Kane's front gate in the middle of the working morning, tools carried openly over their shoulders. They crossed the entire city in a single line that had grown a crowd of its own by the time it reached the eastern wall. I met them at Emberhold's gate myself, with most of the town gathered by then, because word had reached us faster than the walk itself had. Corin set his own appraiser's scale down on the ground in front of me, the same one, I would learn later, that he had used to weigh the counterfeit stock the day it failed the guild test, and said he was done using it to weigh anything he could not personally stand behind. I told him he would not need to weigh a single dishonest thing again as long as he worked in this town, and handed him back his own scale and told him to use it as he always should have been allowed to. The crowd that had gathered to watch cheered as crowds cheer when they get to see something rare. 7 skilled hands choosing a harder, poorer, more honest path in front of the very people they were leaving behind. I noticed, watching it, that several of the faces cheering loudest were ordinary Thornmere residents who had never once bought a single piece of scale in their lives and simply liked watching a good thing happen in public. Gareth arrived at his own gate not long after, alone this time, no clerks, no steward, and watched the last of his own house's most skilled workers cross a square he no longer fully controlled. I watched him watch it from across that same distance, close enough to see his face and far enough that neither of us needed to speak. He did not shout. He did not send anyone after them. He only stood there a long moment and then turned and went back inside, and something about the quality of that retreat told me, more clearly than any argument could have, that whatever came next from him was not going to arrive through his front gate ever again. I did not enjoy watching a man lose everything he had built his identity around. Not entirely, even after everything he had done. I found, standing there, that I mostly felt tired. The particular tiredness of a fight that had stopped being about winning some time ago and had become, instead, simply about making sure it eventually ended. Corin and Fenna and the 5 others were measured that same evening, one after another, in front of the whole gathered town, each scale a different shade I had not yet seen in my case, and the ledger grew heavier by 7 names in a single night, more than any single week, since I had woken into this life. Fenna, the youngest of them, asked me quietly, once her own measure was finished, whether leaving House Kane meant she would never again be considered a proper appraiser anywhere in the city. I told her the opposite was true, that the guild had watched a Kane-owned scale collapse under a single guild inspector's thumb, and that from this evening forward her own name, freely chosen and publicly given, was worth considerably more than any house seal had ever actually guaranteed. Their first evening at the shared hearth did not go entirely smoothly. Korin tried, out of 11 years of habit, to weigh his portion of stew against everyone else's before he ate it. Han informed him, without much patience, that Adrian did not run a house where anybody weighed a bowl before eating it, and that Emberhold's kitchen had one rule only, which was that everybody ate until they were done, and that his scale could stay in his workshop where it belonged. He looked genuinely lost for a moment. A man who had spent over a decade measuring fairness in exact numbers suddenly told that fairness here simply meant a full bowl and a seat at the table. Fenna laughed at him so hard she had to set her own bowl down. The first real laugh I had heard out of either of them since they walked through the gate. Pell adopted Fenna within the hour, as she adopted every new arrival close enough to her age to be worth recruiting. She spent the rest of the evening explaining, at length and with her small chalk-marked ruler as a prop, which forges in the row ran hot and which ran honest, a distinction she considered far more important than anyone else seemed to. 14 names in the ledger now, a forge row that could barely keep pace with its own new hands, a house cane gate standing open behind 7 empty workbenches, and a man I had once watched praise a bench before taking it away, standing alone in his doorway, finally understanding, as I had understood it over 2 fresh graves, how much a name costs once the people who built it start walking away from it. Mira came back from the Crown Court 3 days after the last of Kane's smiths crossed the square and set her fan down on my counter with more force than I had ever seen her use on anything. Gareth petitioned all 3 courts, she said, not just the Crown's own council, sent riders to the northern and southern thrones both, within a week of losing his workshop staff, which tells you he stopped believing he could win this fight through Thornmere's own guild hall a while before we actually beat him in it. I asked what the petition claimed. She said it did not mention debts or forged marks or a warehouse fire at all. It claimed instead that Emberhold harbored beings capable of walking undetected among ordinary people, a danger to public safety no single city guild had authority to govern, and that only direct crown oversight, administered through a house the crown already trusted, could keep the realm safe from it. That was, I understood immediately, the one weapon Gareth had never actually needed to forge or buy. He had simply needed to say the true thing loudly enough, framed the wrong way, and let ordinary fear do the rest of the work for him. Mira said the Northern Throne had already sent a formal inquiry, asking whether the rumor was true, whether creatures walked among the crown's own subjects entirely undetected, and that the Southern Throne, more cautiously, had asked only whether Emberhold's charter needed reviewing before its next tax cycle. I asked what she had told them. She said she had told them nothing yet, because the truth, stated plainly and without Gareth's framing around it, was actually the strongest answer available, and she wanted my word before she used it, that I understood what saying it out loud would cost. I asked what it would cost. She said that once every court in this realm knew for certain dragons could pass unnoticed as anyone, unnoticed became the one thing nobody would ever fully believe again. It would not be about their neighbor alone, or their spouse, or the merchant who had sold them bread every morning for a decade. Fear that specific does not stay contained to the people who deserve it. I thought of the man in appraiser's graze at the fair, still unnamed to anyone but me, still standing close enough to Gareth's own house that saying the truth out loud might, eventually, reach exactly the wrong ears before I was ready for it too. I told Mira I needed a few more days before deciding how much truth to hand 3 separate crowns at once. She agreed reluctantly and said the courts would wait, for now, on the strength of her own standing with them. But that waiting was not the same as forgetting, and that Gareth's petition had already planted a question in 3 royal minds that would not fully unplant itself no matter what I eventually said. The second visitor arrived 4 days later, and this time, Halvik Ost did not come alone, or unarmed, or asking permission at the gate. He rode at the head of perhaps 40 riders in order colors, and stopped short of the wall itself, close enough to be seen clearly, and far enough to make the intention of the distance obvious to anyone watching. I walked out to meet him myself, and found his face harder than it had been the evening he ate our stew, tired in a different way now. The tiredness of a man carrying out an order he had argued against and lost the argument. The Order's Council voted 3 days ago, he said, without preamble, to formally restrict all trade routes running through hunting territory to anyone carrying goods bearing your mark. until the crown resolves the question your rival's petition raised. I did not vote for it. I lost the vote badly enough that arguing further would have cost me the seat that still lets me make sure this stays a blockade and not a war. I asked what the difference actually was, practically, between the two. He said a blockade stopped supply and let both sides negotiate under pressure. A war started when someone on either side decided pressure alone was not moving fast enough, and he intended to make certain that decision never got made on his side of this line, whatever it cost him personally to prevent it. I told him I understood the vote's logic, even while I hated its outcome, and asked plainly what it would take to end it. He said the honest answer was complicated, that some of his counsel believed Gareth's framing, that Emberhold represented a hidden danger rather than an open one, and that the rest, more practically, wanted assurance the hunting trade would not vanish before their families found another way to eat. I told him that the second concern I could answer honestly, right there, standing at the wall with his riders in sight behind him. I intended to build that other way, apprenticeships, forge work, appraisal training, open to any hunting family willing to learn a trade that did not require killing anything to survive by it. And I would put the offer in writing if it moved even one vote in a direction he could work with. He considered that a while, with the same unhurried care he had brought to my stew months before, and said it might move a handful of votes eventually, but that it would not move the ones who genuinely believed the danger itself was real, and that only proof, one way or the other, was ever going to move those. I asked what proof would satisfy people who believed dragons already walked among them undetected, doing harm nobody could see. He was quiet a while, and then said that the honest answer was that some fears did not actually want proof, because proof risked disappointing them, and that he did not know yet whether the council's fear was that kind or the other kind, the kind that could still be answered. He rode back to his line without crossing the wall, and the blockade held from that morning forward. Wagons turned back at every crossing that carried Emberhold's mark. Supply routes I had spent months building quietly strangled the same way Gareth had once tried to strangle the open-scale market itself. Nira found me that evening going over what stores we actually had left, and said, in her flattest voice, that we could hold perhaps 6 weeks on grain alone before the town started genuinely rationing, and considerably less than that on the metals the Forge Row needed to keep taking new commissions. I sat with that number a long while after she left, turning it over as I turned over every number that actually mattered, and understood that Gareth had finally found, after every other door I had closed on him, the one weapon that did not require lying about a single fact. He had simply told the truth in the shape most likely to frighten people who had never once had reason to think about it before, and let their own fear finish the siege for him. I did not yet know how to answer a fear that specific with anything less than the very truth Mira had warned me not to hand 3 crowns until I was certain what it would cost. I only knew, standing at a gate that had once welcomed anyone who would let himself be measured honestly, that the next months were going to test how much that welcome was actually worth when the whole world outside it had started to believe the worst possible version of what it meant. Rationing started in the 3rd week of the blockade, quietly, Tan cutting the shared hearth's portions before anyone had to ask her to, and it was somewhere in that same week that a woman named Selene walked through Emberhold's gate and asked to be measured. She said she had heard about the siege from a trader 2 valleys over, and had come specifically because of it, because a town under this much pressure needed material to sell more than it needed anything else, and she intended to give what she had freely, the same as everyone else in the ledger, no different. I measured her as I measured everyone, slow, naming each length aloud, and she talked the entire time, warmly, about how much she admired what I had built, how she had always wanted to belong somewhere that measured a person by their own hand rather than by what could be taken from them. It was, I would understand only later, the right thing to say to a man 3 weeks into a siege, and tired enough to want very badly to believe it. The scale that worked loose was a dull, flat gray, lifeless in a way none of the others had ever been, and it lay in my palm without so much as catching the evening light, which even Isolde's rough early piece had managed. Corin was in the shop when it happened, checking a batch of finished plate, And he crossed the room the moment he saw the color, turned it once in his own fingers, and told me quietly, in the flat professional voice of a man who had spent 11 years learning exactly this distinction, that it was a 0. Not low, 0. The kind of scale that comes off someone who felt nothing at all handing it over, or worse, someone who felt the opposite of what they were performing. Celine's warmth did not survive that sentence intact, and it did not vanish either, not at first, not while she still believed the room could be talked around. She tried the same tone again, softer, insisting Corin was unfamiliar with her case, that some people's true feeling ran quieter than the ledger's usual signs, and I wanted, for one uncomfortable moment, to believe her over my appraiser. Corin did not back down. He set the scale on the counter between us and said, evenly, that quiet was not the same as false. He had handled enough of both across 11 years to know the difference at a glance, and that whatever Selene had been feeling while I measured her, it had not been anything close to what she had spent the last quarter hour telling me it was. I asked her, plainly, what she wanted. She held out a long moment before answering, the performance finally cracking somewhere behind her eyes. Her brother owed a debt to a moneylender 2 valleys over, she said, in a smaller voice than the one she had walked in with, the kind that ends with a person sold into indenture if it goes unpaid past the season's turn. She had heard that a single honest scale out of Adrian Vale's shop could pay off almost any debt in the valley. She had come, she admitted, intending to perform whatever feeling the measure required, because she did not believe feeling had anything real to do with it, only that the story sold better dressed up that way. She had assumed wrongly that any scale at all would fetch the price she needed regardless of how it came off her arm. I told her the truth of the rule as plainly as I understood it myself, that it was not a punishment and never had been, only a fact about the material, the same way green wood warps and dry wood does not. Nothing about her debt or her brother made her a worse person for not having understood that before she walked in. She did not seem to find that comforting. She asked quietly whether that meant she had wasted the only thing she had left to offer. I told her it meant the scale itself was worth nothing on the open market, but that the offer underneath it, however she had dressed it up walking in, was not nothing at all, and asked whether she would be willing to stay and actually earn what she had tried to fake her way into instead. She looked at me like the question did not entirely make sense, as though the offer had arrived in a language nobody had taught her. I told her Emberhold needed hands as much as it needed material. More, some weeks, with the siege eating into everything the Forge Row could otherwise be doing, and that if she would lie about a feeling to help her brother, she wanted him safe badly enough to work for it too. She stayed. Not easily and not gracefully. The first few weeks were awkward in a way the rest of the town noticed, and, to their credit, mostly did not comment on directly. She swept the Forge Row, hauled water, learned the difference between a good weld and a bad one from Corin, who turned out to have considerably more patience for teaching than he had ever shown for appraising a lie. Pell, who had appointed herself quality inspector of the entire town some months before, took a particular interest in Celine's progress, checking her swept floors with the same chalk-marked ruler she used on finished plate. Honest work, she told her with total seriousness, looks exactly like honest scale once you know what to look for in it. I sent what small coin the town could spare toward her brother's debt within the month, not payment for a scale that had never been real, only a loan against work she had already started doing, and told her plainly that the rest of it she would need to earn herself, the same as everyone else standing in this Forge Row. She did not offer to be measured again for a long while after that, and I did not ask her to, because asking would have turned it back into a price. When she finally did, nearly a year later, by the reckoning I kept in my head, if not in the ledger's dates, the scale held real color, a soft, honest amber, low on the scale still, and entirely true, and Corin, testing it without a word from me, only nodded and set it beside the others. I did not learn until much later, from Tan, how close Celine's brother had come to losing everything before that first loan arrived, and I understood, hearing it, that the whole strange detour had cost this town almost nothing, and had likely saved a family I would otherwise never have known existed. Siege did not lift because of any of that. 6 weeks became 7, then 8, grain thinner at every meal, and I thought, watching Celine sweep a floor she had once tried to lie her way past, that the town's real strength through that stretch had never been the Forge Row's output at all. It had been exactly this: ordinary people choosing, slowly and imperfectly, to become the kind of person the Ledger could actually trust, one honest week at a time. The Crown's answer to Gareth's petition arrived in the 8th week of the siege, and it did not come as a letter. It came as a man in appraiser's greys, riding alone, unescorted, presenting himself at Emberhold's gate as an independent assessor, sent jointly by all 3 thrones to determine, in person, whether the town posed the danger House Kane's petition claimed it did. I knew him before he ever gave a name, as I had known him across a crowded fair square months before, a shape underneath the shape, a noso nos state. Patient in a way no ordinary appraiser's stillness ever quite managed. Gave his name anyway, formally and at length. For the record, Kaelus's watch was keeping at the gate that morning. Corvin Kane, chief appraiser of House Kane, appointed by royal commission to inspect the settlement independently of his house's interest, since his decades of appraisal experience made him, in the Crown's stated view, uniquely qualified to judge the matter fairly. I did not point out the obvious problem in that appointment, that a man sharing a house name with my chief rival was an unusual choice for impartiality. Looking at him, I understood that the Crown almost certainly had no idea how unimpartial the choice was, in a direction none of their advisors had ever thought to consider. I walked him through the Forge Row myself, past Corn's bench, past the shared hearth, where Selena was scrubbing pots with the particular focus of someone still proving something to herself more than to anyone watching. He took notes the entire way in a small bound book, careful, thorough, exactly the performance a royal inspector was supposed to give. He asked to see the ledger. I showed it to him, all 14 names, the dates, the witnesses, and he read it as Nira had once read it, slowly, checking each line. I watched him do it, knowing that he, of everyone who had ever examined that book, was the only reader who fully understood what every single entry actually meant. He set the ledger down and looked at me directly, which he had not once done since arriving at my gate that morning. He said quietly, in a voice pitched for the 2 of us and no one else nearby, that he had appraised scale for House Kane for over 2 centuries under one guise or another, and had never once in all that time seen a book like this one. I asked what he meant by that. He said most of what passed through his hands across 200 years had a story attached to it, a hunt, a debt, a bargain struck under duress. This ledger was the first he had ever read, where every line told the same story in a different voice, freely, without a single entry he could find fault with. I told him that was the entire point of the thing, and asked, since we had apparently stopped pretending, why a man capable of appraising honestly for 2 centuries had spent so much of that time doing the opposite, dressing dead scale as living, letting a house built partly on force call itself a fair trade. Did not answer immediately. He walked a few paces further along the row, past the empty half-finished bench Emberhold's newest apprentice had left mid-lesson. He had built the appraisal system himself, he said, 2 centuries ago, back when his kind trusted almost no human enough to be measured honestly at all, and dressing the trade up as fair, even when it was not, had once been the only way to keep either side from killing the other over it. He said the system had outlived the reason he built it, as most systems do, and that watching it curdle into exactly the kind of taking it was meant to prevent had been, for longer than he wanted to admit, easier to ignore than to unmake. I asked whether he intended to report the truth of what he was to the Crown, since his very presence here suggested he might, sent specifically to judge whether beings like him posed a hidden danger. He held my eye a moment and said, quietly, that the answer to that question depended entirely on what I intended to do with the truth I had already been carrying about him since the day we first met. I told him I had not spoken it to a single soul in this town, not Nira, not Mira, not even Pell, because I had decided, standing across a fair square from him months ago, that it was not mine to spend until spending it actually served something worth the cost. He asked what that cost, in my own estimation, would be. I told him the truth Mira had already warned me about, that once the world knew for certain his kind could pass entirely unnoticed. Unnoticed itself would become a wound nobody trusted closing again. He said that was almost precisely the argument he had used to justify silence himself for 2 centuries. Hearing it from someone who had known the truth for less than a season and had still chosen to sit on it rather than spend it carelessly told him something about me his long study of ledgers never could have. He wrote his report that evening at my counter, by candlelight, and read the closing lines aloud before he sealed it. The language was formal. The settlement at Emberhold posed no demonstrable danger to the crown's subjects beyond the ordinary risks of any trade town, and the petitioning house's claims appeared, upon independent inspection, to be substantially unsupported by evidence. Did not write a single word about what he was. I did not ask him to, and did not offer to either, and something in that restraint felt, standing there, watching him seal the report, less like a secret we were keeping together and more like a debt neither of us had decided how the other would repay. He rode out the next morning, the report already dispatched ahead of him to all 3 courts, and told me, at the gate, Munfrey e Asra Elfrey Tats, one last thing before he left. Gareth does not know what I am. He has never asked, because it would never occur to him that a man who has served his family for 2 centuries might be older than the family itself. When he finally learns it, and he will eventually, it will not go the way either of us expects. I did not fully understand that warning until much later, but I turned it over the entire ride back to the shop. Whatever quiet arrangement Corvin and I had just struck across my counter, it was not going to stay quiet forever, and when it finally broke, it was going to break loudest in the one direction I had least prepared for. The report reached the crowns within the week, and the Northern Throne, satisfied, ordered the blockade lifted within the month pending a final review. Alvik Ost brought that news to the gate himself on a morning cold enough that his breath showed, and said plainly that it was the first genuinely good order he had been glad to carry in over 2 months. I asked whether it meant the fight was over. He gave me the same look he had given me the first evening we shared a bowl of stew, tired, honest, unwilling to promise more than he actually believed. It means the crown believes you are not a danger, he said. It does not mean my own people have stopped being afraid of losing their only trade, and fear that old does not end just because a royal seal says it should. The blockade lifted 12 days later, wagons moving freely again for the first time in nearly 3 months. Emberhold's gates opened to supply routes that had been closed since the fire, and for one full evening the town celebrated as towns celebrate when they have survived something they were not certain they would. I did not celebrate as fully as the rest of them. I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Pell dance badly and happily with Fenna near the new hearth. I thought about a man riding away with a secret he had asked me to keep a while longer, and a warden telling me plainly that the end of one fight had done nothing to end the fear underneath it. Whatever came next would not arrive through the front gate any more gently. The attack came 9 nights after the blockade lifted, past the second watch change, when the town had finally started sleeping as it had not slept properly in 3 months. It was not the order that came through the tree line at the western fence. It was perhaps 20 men, hunting gear rather than uniform, no colors at all, which told me before anyone else said a word that this was not sanctioned by anything Halvik Ost's council had actually voted on. Kalis had the watch doubled the moment the first alarm bell rang, exactly the system she had built out of the ruin of the last fire. 2 to a post, no gaps, and it held long enough for the rest of the town to reach the forge row before the line at the fence properly broke. The bell had me on my feet inside 3 seconds, trained into me every night since the warehouse burned, and Pell reached the workshop door before I had finished pulling on my boots, already dressed, already counting under her breath, as she had not counted since the licensing yard. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, to get every child in the row, down to the shelter cellar, and stay there herself until someone came for her by name. She argued for one breath, as she argued about everything now that she had grown old enough to have opinions worth arguing, and then she went because some part of her still remembered, clearly enough to obey it instantly, exactly what a night like this could cost a town that hesitated. I reached the fence with a half-finished blade still warm from the forge in one hand, because there had been no time to reach for anything better, and no honest reason to pretend I would have known what to do with a better one. The men at the fence were not soldiers, and it showed in how they fought, angry and untrained and dangerous in precisely the manner angry, untrained men become dangerous, swinging wide, committing fully to strikes that left them open the moment they missed. Kalis dropped the first 3 herself, fast, economical, the same flat precision she brought to everything. She called out over the noise for the forge row to hold the fence line and let no one past it into the town proper, where families were still getting children out of bed and moving toward the shelter cellar Nira had insisted we dig in the second month of building. I did not fight as Kalis fought. I fought as my grandfather taught me to work, reading the shape of a strike before it landed and answering it with exactly enough force to end it rather than escalate it. And it was enough, at the fence line, to keep two separate men from getting past me toward the shelter. Corin fought too, older than most of the men swinging at him, precise in a way that surprised the attacker across from him more than once, and Fenna stood behind him, passing blades from the row's own stock as fast as anyone could use them. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the second sound reached us. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast from the same tree line the attackers had come through, and for one bad second I thought it meant a second wave. It was Halvik Ost, at the head of a full column of order riders, and he did not slow at the fence at all. He rode straight into the fight itself, put himself physically between two of his own people's hunting knives and the line Kalis was holding, and shouted one order in a voice that carried over every other sound on that field. Stand down, now, in the order's name and the crown's both. Most of them stopped. A handful did not, and Ost's own riders moved to restrain them rather than strike them down. Even in the middle of everything still happening, that told me that whatever else this man was, he had not ridden out intending to let a single one of his own people die over a decision the council had never authorized. The fighting stopped entirely within another minute. Ukraine spots one stall. The attackers disarmed and held by order riders rather than by Emberhold's own exhausted watch. I stood at the fence line with a bad cut along one forearm I had not noticed taking, breathing hard, watching Ost dismount and walk the length of the fence himself, checking, I understood, how much damage his own people's fear had done in a single night. He found me near the gate and said, without any preamble at all, that these men belonged to three families who had lost their trade routes hardest during the blockade. They had decided, on their own, outside every proper channel, that the crown's ruling meant nothing if the hunt itself was already ending underneath them regardless. I asked how he had known to ride out that exact night. Not with certainty, Adrian, he said. He had only been watching those three families closely since the blockade lifted, because a man who has spent his whole life reading fear for a living recognizes it building towards something long before it breaks. Vesa arrived not long after, moving through the wounded on both sides of the fence with the same careful distance and the same complete focus she brought to everyone. She treated an order rider's shoulder wound with the attention she gave the Emberhold guard, bleeding 2 paces from him, and I noticed Ost watching that closely, the way a man watches something he had not expected to see. She does not ask which side a wound belongs to before she treats it, I told him. That has never once been how this town works. He said nothing to that for a while, and then quietly that it was possibly the single truest thing anyone had told him about this place since the day he first rode up to this gate and ate its stew. He stayed until dawn, overseeing his own people's arrest and the wounded's care both. And before he finally rode out, he told me something I had not expected to hear from him at all. He intended to bring the full truth of that night, not the sanitized version his council would prefer, directly to the crown himself in person. He intended it to be the argument that finally ended the standing blockade authorization for good on his order's official record, not merely the crown's temporary lifting of it. I asked what had changed his mind so completely, after months of holding a careful, honest middle between his people's fear and mine. He looked back at the fence line, at Vesa's gloved hands still working, at Kalis walking the perimeter checking every post twice as she always did. He had spent 3 months arguing that Emberhold might be dangerous enough to justify his people's fear, he said, and had just watched with his own eyes which side of that fence treated an enemy's wound like it mattered. He rode out at first light, his own people bound and shamed behind him, and I stood at the fence with my forearm finally bandaged by Vesa's own hand. Whatever came next in this fight, the warden of the Hunter's Order was no longer standing anywhere close to Gareth Kane's side of it, and had likely never belonged there at all. Hell came up from the shelter cellar once the last of the order riders had gone, the youngest children trailing behind her in a ragged line she had clearly kept in order the entire night through sheer force of will. She counted them out loud at the top of the stairs, one by one, until every single name matched the list she had apparently kept in her head throughout. She found me still standing at the fence and asked, in a small voice that had nothing of her usual quality, Inspector Confidence left in it, whether it would always be like this now. One fire and then a quiet stretch and then another fire, forever, without ever actually ending. I told her the honest answer, that I did not know, only that every single time it had happened so far, this town had come out the other side of it a little harder to break than it had been the night before, and that I intended to keep it that way, for as long as either of us drew breath to manage it. The plate above the forge read Tier 6 by the time the sun was fully up, earned, I understood without checking the ledger for the reason, on a night that cost this town blood and cost Gareth Kane, the one ally whose doubt he had spent the entire siege trying to weaponize against me. The hearing that finally broke House Kane in a single day did not start out looking like the kind of hearing that breaks anything at all. It started as a contract dispute, dull enough on paper that Mira told me most of the guild hall's regular observers would likely skip it entirely. 3 foundries and a royal shipwrights yard held standing contracts with House Kane for fireproof lining and hardened plate, signed years before any of this began, and all 4 filed complaints in the same season, stating plainly that Kane could no longer deliver material meeting the contract's own written standard. Nira had built the case for months without telling me most of it, quietly gathering every failed delivery, every rejected batch, every foundry that had turned to Emberhold in the meantime, because Kane's own supply had simply stopped being reliable enough to trust. She laid it out for the hall in the flat, exact voice she brought to everything, 3 readings deep before she ever said a word aloud. House Kane's registered stock, since the warehouse inspection, had fallen to less than half its former volume. Its most skilled smiths and appraisers had left for Emberhold. What remained could not meet the contracts already signed, and the 4 complaining parties had a binding remedy available under guild law, an order compelling the defaulting house to source material elsewhere to fulfill its obligations at its own cost from whichever supplier could deliver it. There was, by that point in the region, exactly one supplier who could. Every man on that bench already knew the name before Nira finished saying it. Gareth stood to answer the complaint himself, his steward notably absent from the front bench this time, and I understood, watching him rise alone, that whatever pride still held him upright in that room was the same pride that had once made him praise a bench before taking it. He argued the contracts should be renegotiated rather than enforced, that a house facing temporary hardship deserved patience rather than punishment. Kor, presiding again, asked him plainly whether temporary was the correct word for a decline that had been building steadily across most of a year through choices his own house had made. Gareth did not have a clean answer to that, and the room felt it. The particular shift a crowd makes when it stops waiting to see who wins and starts simply watching a loss happen in real time. He changed course then, as a cornered man changes course, and said something I had not expected and would not have believed possible from him a year before. He said the crisis facing his house traced back to one uncomfortable truth nobody in this hall wanted to say aloud. Vale's success was not honest craft at all, but some manner of unnatural advantage, an ability to see and command these creatures that no ordinary man possessed. The guild owed it to every legitimate house in this city to investigate what Adrian Vale was before ruling in his favor on anything. A murmur ran through the hall, uneasy, the specific kind of fear that spreads faster than any argument built to counter it. I understood standing there that Gareth had just tried to fire the same weapon he had once fired through 3 royal courts, dressed up this time as a direct accusation rather than a petition. I could have denied it. I could have let Mira argue procedure, could have let Nira's numbers alone carry the day as they likely would have eventually regardless. Instead, I found myself thinking of 2 graves at the edge of the forge row, and a warden who had ridden through his own people to stop a fight neither of us wanted, and a man in appraiser's grays who had told me, plainly, that this moment would not land where either of us expected it to. I asked Kor for leave to answer the accusation directly, in full rather than through Mira or through paper, and he granted it without hesitating. I told the hall the truth, that I could see, since waking into this life, something no one else in that room apparently could, a shape underneath a shape, when it stood close enough and still enough for long enough to be looked at properly. I had known it about one person since the autumn fair and had kept it silent for months because it was not mine to spend on anything less than something worth the cost it would carry. Gareth demanded immediately to know who. I told him the truth was standing close enough to answer for himself and turned toward the appraiser's bench at the back of Kane's own delegation, where Corvin Kane sat exactly where he had sat through every hearing I had ever seen him attend. The hall went entirely silent. Gareth turned too, slowly, and I watched something move across his face that I had genuinely never seen there before. Not arithmetic this time, not composure recovering itself. Simple, complete confusion. The look of a man being handed a fact his whole life had never once made room for. Corvin did not deny it. He rose from the bench, unhurried, with the same stillness he had brought to every appraisal I had ever watched him give. He said, in a voice that carried the length of the hall, without needing to be raised, that Adrian Vale's sight was accurate, and that he saw no purpose left in denying 2 centuries of it in front of a room finally asking the honest question. I have appraised for this house since before its current head's grandfather was born, he said, and I built the very system this hall still uses to weigh worth by trust rather than by blood, back when trust between our two kinds was rarer and considerably more dangerous to extend than it has become in the years since. I did it because the alternative then was closer to war than to commerce. I let it curdle, over time, into something considerably less honest than I once intended, and I did not stop it soon enough to spare the man standing beside me the cost of finishing what I should have finished myself. Gareth found his voice again somewhere in the middle of that, and it came out smaller than I had ever heard it. He asked, in a tone with no performance left in it at all, whether that meant every judgment his house had trusted for 200 years had come from something his family had never once known was standing in the room with them. Corvin said yes, plainly, and did not soften it, and something in Gareth seemed to fold inward at the answer in a way that had nothing to do with the contracts still sitting unresolved on the table in front of him. Aurelia had come to witness the hearing at Mira's quiet invitation, and had been sitting unremarked near the back of the hall the entire morning. She rose then. She confirmed to the assembled guild what her own centuries of memory already knew, that Corvin's account of the system's founding matched the oldest records her people still kept of that era, and that his standing among the eldest of her kind, whatever he had allowed himself to become since, was not in question. Cor, when the hall finally settled enough to hear him, ruled on the original complaint first, since it was, he said, still the actual matter before this bench regardless of what else the morning had uncovered. House Kane was ordered to source the material for all 4 outstanding contracts from Vale Workshop at Kane's own cost, effective immediately. The exact remedy Nira's numbers had already made close to inevitable before Gareth ever stood up to argue against it. Then he addressed the second matter, more carefully, and said that a chief appraiser's true nature, however long concealed, did not by itself invalidate 2 centuries of otherwise verifiable appraisal work. But House Kane's fitness to hold its licenses going forward would require a full separate review, given how thoroughly its leadership had never known the true qualifications of the man whose judgment it had built its fortune upon. Gareth left the hall before the session formally closed, alone, as he had once left a furnace hall without his usual parting joke, and I watched him go and felt, again, mostly tired, the same tiredness I had felt watching 7 of his own craftsmen walk away from him months before. Corvin found me outside afterward, in the last of the afternoon light, and said, quietly, that he had expected to feel considerably worse than he actually did, now that the truth was finally out of his hands after 2 centuries of carrying it alone. I asked what he felt instead. He considered the question as he considered everything, unhurried, and said simply, relief, and something that might, given time to grow into it properly, become the same kind of trust he had just watched a hall extend to a ledger built on nothing but honest names. I told him Emberhold's gate was open to him, the same as it was to anyone, and he looked at me for a long moment, the particular stillness of a very old thing, deciding whether an offer that simple could possibly be as sincere as it sounded, and said finally that he might, in time, actually take me up on it. Thornmere talked about nothing else for a full week after the hearing, and the talk did House Kane considerably more damage than the ruling itself ever could have, because a ruling can be appealed and a whole city deciding it no longer trusts your name cannot. Two more of Kane's clients canceled standing contracts within days, neither of them under any legal obligation to do so, both citing, plainly, that they no longer felt confident the house understood its own business well enough to guarantee anything it sold. I had not gone looking for that outcome. I found, walking through the market that week, that I mostly wanted to be left alone with ordinary work for a while, and Isolde, of everyone in the shop, seemed to understand that better than anyone else did. She had taken over most of the burn ward liaison work since the furnace trial, quietly, without anyone formally asking her to. She came by that week with no interest in discussing Kane at all, only to report, plainly, that 3 more burn patients had asked after fireproof cloth of their own, and did I have material to spare for it. I told her I always had material to spare for that, specifically, and she nodded, satisfied, and left again without another word about the hearing. And I found that silence considerably more restful than anything anyone else had offered me that week. Elle had grown enough since the licensing yard that she barely resembled the frightened child Gareth had once taken by the wrist. She marked the anniversary of that morning, unprompted, by walking the entire forge row with her chalk ruler and declaring, formally, that every single bench in it met her own standard at last, which not one of them had managed since she started checking. Fenna threw her arms around Pell when she heard the announcement, and the two of them spent the rest of the afternoon arguing happily about whether Corin's newest apprentice batch counted as row standard or merely close to it. The argument ran long enough that Tana eventually had to separate them from their work to make them eat. That was the shape most of Emberhold's days had taken by then, ordinary in a way that would have sounded impossible to the frightened man who had woken 11 minutes before Gareth Kane first walked through his door. Town arguing about bench standards instead of debt. A girl once taken by the wrist, now the loudest voice on the row about what honest work actually looked like. Tana had grown into her own role considerably past what either of us had imagined the day I offered her the first name in Emberhold's ledger. She ran the town's daily business as a seasoned mayor runs a council, settling small disputes before they grew into large ones. And she came to me that week with a proposal she had clearly been sitting on for a while before finding the right moment to raise it. A proper school, she said, more than apprenticeship at the bench, a real school, cutting, setting, appraisal. It would take any child in the town, regardless of what family had raised them or what they had shed or never shed at all, so the next generation would not need a man who died in a fire to teach them the difference between honest work and the other kind. I told her that was the kind of thing this town existed to become, and asked what she needed to start it. She said mostly time and one dedicated building, and I told her the Forge Row's western end had room enough, and that I would rather spend coin on that building than on almost anything else the ledger currently owed for. Mira returned from the Crown Court that same week with news of her own, delivered with considerably more satisfaction than she usually allowed herself to show in public. The Northern Throne had agreed, formally, to receive a standing representative from Emberhold at court, the first seat of its kind ever offered to anyone of dragon blood in that hall's long history. She had already chosen the words she intended to use accepting it, she told me, and asked whether I wanted to hear them before she delivered them to a room full of nobles who had spent their lives assuming a seat like that would never exist. I told her I trusted her with every word of it. Kalis, when she heard the news secondhand from Fenna over the evening meal, said only that a seat at court was worth less than a wall that held. Then Vessa pointed out that Mira's seat and Kalis's wall protected the exact same people, and she admitted the two things were not as separate as she had first made them sound. Orvin Kane arrived at the gate himself 11 days after the hearing, alone, on foot this time, rather than horseback, and asked, quietly, whether the offer I had made him outside the guild hall still stood. I told him it had never once stopped standing. He looked in a state I had never once seen from him in any capacity, genuinely uncertain of himself, a strangeness that sat oddly on someone who had carried 2 centuries of composed silence without visibly cracking under any of it. He asked to be measured last of all, once he had walked the row and met most of the town properly and by name. Let the record show it as it happened, Adrian, he said, when I finally took his hand measure, that he had asked plainly, the same as everyone else, rather than announcing himself as his old habits might have preferred. The scale that came loose was old gold, heavier than even Aurelia's had been, and Corin tested it beside me out of the same professional habit he brought to everything. He went still a while, before saying that he had appraised thousands of pieces across his career and had never once held anything carrying this much history in a single small object. 15 names in the ledger by then, and the 15th had been standing in that trade 200 years before the first one was born. I asked Corvin what he intended to do with a new start this late in a life this long. He said, after a moment's genuine thought, that he intended to teach if Tan's school would have him, since 2 centuries of appraising other people's worth had left him better suited to that than to anything requiring a hammer. Tan accepted before I had even finished relaying the offer, delighted in a way that made the exchange feel, for a moment, entirely ordinary. One more skilled hand finding its place in a town that had room for exactly that kind of thing now. Gareth Kane, meanwhile, had not been seen in public since the day he walked out of the guild hall alone. Nira, who still tracked every movement touching the guild's own records out of habit more than obligation, told me his formal license review had been scheduled for the coming month, and that House Kane's remaining staff had shrunk quietly to a fraction of what it had been even after the Smiths first left. I asked her whether she felt anything at all, watching a man's entire inheritance collapse this completely. She considered the question with her usual 3 passes of thought before answering, and said honestly that she felt less satisfaction than she had expected to, months ago, when this fight had still felt like it might end in something closer to triumph than to this quiet, almost sad unwinding. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. I had spent the better part of a year building toward exactly this outcome. When Charleston beat Steinnight. Standing in the middle of it, I found myself thinking less about victory and more about 2 graves at the end of the forge row, and a man alone somewhere across the city, with a name that no longer meant what it used to. The ending still had an unfinished shape to it, one more turn left in it, before either of us could call it done. The guild summoned every licensed house in Thornmere to the main hall for the final reading, which was not, strictly speaking, required by any procedure Mira could find written down anywhere. She told me she suspected Cor had simply wanted every house in the city to hear it together rather than let the outcome reach anyone secondhand. He read House Kane's charter aloud in full, start to finish, the same document Gareth had once unrolled on my own counter to take my grandfather's workshop and Pell both. Hearing it read out in a guild hall a year later felt like watching a wound finally close over, slower than I expected and more painful in the closing than I had imagined it would be. Cor reached the final clause and set the scroll down without ceremony. By order of this hall, confirmed under Crown Seal, the license of House Kane is annulled in full, effective this hour. Its outstanding contracts were transferred as previously ordered. Its remaining assets made subject to a formal accounting to satisfy its creditors, chief among them Vale Workshop of Emberhold. The accounting that followed took 9 days. When it closed, the license bonds House Kane had held over every forge on Kale Row passed to Vale Workshop in settlement, the entire row of them, the same narrow street that had stood outside my door, and murmured approval while Gareth read my grandfather's debt aloud. I had told him that morning I would buy it back with 1 scale. The buying took a year, and the scale turned out to be the first of 16, but the second line I opened in my grandfather's ledger that same night finally had a number to close against. I had expected, somewhere in the months leading up to that sentence, to feel something closer to triumph hearing it. What I actually felt, standing in a hall that had once cheered Gareth's manners and now sat in near total silence at his ruin, was considerably quieter than that and harder to name. Halvik Ost spoke next. Vombitor Sinalsen by Spoinse was Bamalur Sepoldi at Cor's invitation and gave the account he had promised months before at the fence line, by plain and complete, by the rogue attack and his own people's fear. The Order's official position going forward was that hunting families deserved support in finding new trades rather than protection for an old one built increasingly on force. He proposed, on the Order's own record, a standing apprenticeship agreement between the Order and Emberhold's new school. I agreed to it there in the hall before he had even finished the formal wording, because it was, I understood, the truest answer either of us had ever managed to the fear that had started this whole siege in the first place. Then Kor read the second decree, the one Mira and Nira had spent the better part of 2 months drafting between them, refined through committee, argued clause by clause until neither of them could find another honest objection to raise against it. Effective this season, the given freely mark becomes the region's mandatory standard for all traded scale. Trade in scale taken by force, or purchased from any party known to have taken it by force, is prohibited outright, the penalty equal to trading in stolen goods of any other kind, with license revocation for a first offense and crown prosecution for any repeat of it. The hall did not cheer that, as it had cheered the fair square or the furnace hall. It sat with it instead, quiet. The quiet of a room absorbing something it understood would change how it did business for the rest of its working life. And I found that silence, oddly, more satisfying than any cheer could have been. I see Gareth in the hall that day. Nira told me later he had not been required to attend his own charter's reading, only informed of the outcome by formal letter, and that nobody, herself included, had expected him to show his face in that room voluntarily after everything it had already taken from him. He came to Emberhold instead, 3 days later, alone, on foot, and did not ask for me at the gate as he once might have. He simply joined the line. Emberhold had, by then, a proper measuring line most mornings, ordinary and unremarkable, newcomers and old residents both waiting their turn the way anyone waits for a baker or a cobbler. It took me a good while to notice, working steadily through the queue, that the man 3 places from the front was Gareth Kane, dressed plainly, waiting like everyone else. I finished the measure ahead of him, a young mason wanting a set of hardened knee guards for scaffolding work, and looked up to find Gareth had not moved forward to claim his place, only stood there, watching me work, until I finally asked whether he intended to take his turn or simply observe the rest of the morning. He stepped forward then and said quietly that he had not come expecting anything, only that he had heard from more than one person now that anyone in this town could ask to be measured. He used my given name, saying it, Adrian, which he had never once done in the whole year he spent taking things from me. He had wanted to see for himself whether that offer had ever actually meant anyone, or only the people it was convenient to extend it to. I told him it had always meant anyone, and asked him to hold out his arm as I asked everyone, and he did, and I began as I always began, slow, naming each length aloud, so he would know exactly what I had and had not touched. He was quiet through most of it, and then, somewhere near the end, said in a voice with none of his old warmth performed into it, that he knew now, fully, what his steward had paid for the night the warehouse burned. He had known for months, and had never once found the courage to come here and say so to my face until today. I told him I already knew he knew. He said that was somehow worse, being told plainly that his silence had been noticed and simply waited out rather than forgotten. I told him I had not been waiting for an apology, so much as waiting to see whether he would ever actually become someone capable of giving one honestly. He asked whether this counted, standing here admitting it. I told him it was a start, and that a start was not the same as an ending. Esk and Orlin were still in the ground behind the forge row, regardless of what either of us said to each other this morning, and would remain there no matter how this conversation ended. He accepted that without arguing it, which told me something had actually shifted in him that no amount of coin or ruling ever could have forced on its own. He asked about Pell quietly, whether she was well, and I told him she ran quality inspection on half the forge row now, and would very likely tell him herself, at length, how far the town had come since the morning he took her by the wrist. He asked, last, about Corvin, and I gave him the truth, that his own house's chief appraiser had taught 2 centuries of trust to a system that eventually betrayed the thing it was built to protect, and now taught children at a school 3 streets from this gate instead. Gareth absorbed that as a man absorbs a loss too large to argue with, quietly, without protest, and asked nothing further about him. I finished his measure. No scale came loose because he had none to give, only ordinary human shoulders and an ordinary human arm. I wrote his name into the ledger anyway, the 16th entry in a book that had opened with one frightened child, because the ledger had never actually been a count of scales at all, only a count of people I had taken the time to see properly, and he was, whatever else he had been, that now. He looked at his own name sitting in ink beside everyone else's, Pel's first entry still at the very top of the page, and said quietly that he did not know yet what he intended to build with whatever was left of his life, now that his family's name no longer opened a single door in this city. I told him Emberhold School could use another set of hands willing to teach honestly what he had once been paid to do dishonestly, if he ever wanted it, and left the offer exactly where I left every offer in this town, open, unforced, his to take or leave on his own time. He did not answer that morning. He only nodded once and left as he had come, on foot, alone, and I watched him go and thought, not for the first time that year, about a grandfather's rule that had somehow ended up governing considerably more of this story than a simple lesson about armor ever should have. Nothing here ever fit a man I did not take the time to measure first, not the friends, and, in the end, apparently not even the enemy. The brass plate over my forge reads Tier 9 now, has for months, ever since the season the Given Freely mark stopped being one workshop's promise and became the whole region's law. I still catch myself, some mornings, running a thumb along the stamped number, the way you touch a scar to prove to yourself it actually healed. Emberhold does not look anything like scorched commons anymore. The forge row runs 3 full streets deep, and Tan's school anchors the western end, with Corvin holding court most afternoons over some apprentice's first attempt at reading a scale's true color. The shared hearth Orlin once built with her own hands still feeds most of the town most evenings, tended now by hands she taught before the fire ever took her. Isolde runs the production floor these days, every commission passing through her steady hands before it ever reaches a customer, and she still asks nothing for herself beyond the work itself, though she laughs considerably more than she used to, and no longer keeps that one arm turned away from anyone. Nira keeps the town's books as she once kept my ledger, 3 readings deep before she trusts a single figure, and Emberhold has never once, under her watch, let a debt go silently unpaid or a promise quietly forgotten, which the rest of the world manages most days without noticing. Corsilis commands the watch in full now, 12 posts instead of 2, and the fence has held clean since the night Halvik Ost rode through his own people to stop a fight neither of us wanted, an arrangement between the Order and this town that has only grown steadier with every season since. Pel inspects every finished piece that leaves this row, ruler no longer too big for her hand, and the apprentices who once laughed at a girl with a chalk-marked stick now compete, quietly, for her approval as I once competed for my own grandfather's. Vessa runs the infirmary at the eastern end, gloves still on, distance still kept, and every burn ward in 3 cities now sends its hardest cases her way first, because word travels eventually about hands that treat every wound the same, regardless of which side of a fence it came from. Mira sits at the council table these days more often than she stands beside it, and Dragonborn representatives, chosen and trained under her watch, now hold seats at all 3 royal courts, heard rather than merely present, the seat she once told me, on a burned commons, she had spent her life being denied. Aurelia returns each season to speak for her people formally, memory made living record, and the 3 families who once lost the most to the blockade now send their own children to Tan's school most seasons, learning a trade that asks nothing of anyone's blood, only of their own 2 hands. Gareth Kane teaches basic appraisal 3 mornings a week, a decision that took him the better part of a year to finally accept, and he still measures every word he says to me carefully, the way a man measures a debt he understands he will be paying in small, honest installments for the rest of his life. Celine, whose second true measure came a full year after her first false one, gave a soft, honest amber that day, low on the scale still and entirely real, and she keeps her own bench now, near Corin's, and still sweeps her own floor every evening, without being asked, out of habit more than obligation. The second line I started in my grandfather's ledger, the night Gareth walked out of that shop, with a charter and a child reads differently now than it did when I wrote it. Pale row, it says, in a hand still shaking from a fire in another world. Under it, in my own steadier hand, and a good deal later than I promised it that morning, paid in full. Pel found me the evening before, sitting on the workshop steps as she used to sit when she was a much smaller girl, and asked, out of nowhere, whether I remembered the exact morning she first shed a scale onto this floor without meaning to. I told her I remembered every part of that morning, better than I remembered most of my own former life, and she said she had been thinking lately about how strange it was that the worst morning of her whole life had also somehow been the true beginning of everything good that came after it. I told her that was not strange at all, only true of most beginnings worth having, and that she would meet it again in other people. She leaned against my shoulder as she had leaned against me in the ash outside the burned warehouse. Except this time, there was nothing in the leaning but ordinary contentment, a girl grown taller than the one Gareth once took by the wrist, certain now of where she belonged. I stood at my own workbench this morning, with a new apprentice in front of me, a boy no older than Pell had been the day I woke into this life. Scale-kin, nervous, holding his measuring arm out like it might be taken from him rather than simply read. I told him what my own grandfather told me, the words themselves considerably older than either of us, and explained them properly this time, which nobody had ever done for me until this whole strange year of my own life had finished teaching me what they actually meant. A measure taken by force never truly fits, no matter how skilled the hands doing the taking. Only a measure given freely in the presence of the person being seen ever actually holds. He asked carefully whether that was only true of armor, Master Adrian. I told him it had never once, in my experience, been only true of armor. Then I knelt down to take his measure properly, the cord light against his shoulder, drawing the line the way my grandfather taught me, from collarbone to elbow, slow enough that he would know, throughout, exactly what I was touching and why. Outside the window behind him, Emberhold's forges burned, as they burned every morning now, warm and steady and entirely ours, a whole free town built out of scorched ground and one honest scale, standing in the same light it had once been too afraid to be seen in at all. I finished the boy's measure and wrote his name into a ledger that had long since outgrown any single book and now filled 3. Then I said the last thing my grandfather ever taught me, the same words spoken once as memory and once as explanation, now spoken a third and final time in the shape he first gave them to me, long before either of us knew how true they would turn out to be. Armor never fits a man you didn't measure.
Dan was handed a maximum level account with 8% of its power and 15 women at the end of it who had each been told by a man in a hurry that he would be back. He never became a fighter. He lost 2 of those lines for good and carried both of them to the end. What he did instead was the thing he had done for 9 years behind a desk in a world that no longer exists. He read the file to the bottom, he went to the expensive entries first, and he told every claimant the truth about what she was worth to him, even when it cost him the answer he wanted. The power was never the reward. The reward was that the waiting stopped.